Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, recent major flaws found in critical open source software has sent the internet into a panic. From Shellshock to Xen, we'll discuss how you can chain some of these recent vulnerabilities to own a box. Then how secure are VLANs, plus a great big batch of your questions, our answers, and much, much more on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 182 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly systems network and administration podcast. We stream this episode live on October 2nd, 2014. This episode is brought to you by our three fine sponsors, Ting, DigitalOcean, and IX Systems. I'll tell you more about those great sponsors as this here show goes on. Our live stream, why, that's powered by the incredible Scale Engine over at ScaleEngine.com. You've got to go check that out. My name is Chris, and joining us every single week is our host, the admin, the tech, and the teacher, Mr. Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Hey, Alan, and welcome back. And I can't wait to hear an update on your trip in the feedback segment of the show.
Yes, we'll have lots of interesting stuff.
Now it's after the fact, I can say. People didn't even know this. Almost no show last week. Almost no show. The HFS array that the shows sit on, because it's a huge amount of data, just stopped mounting the morning we were going to publish. Just stopped mounting. But
one question is why you're still using HFS for storing important videos.
Well, like that. Well, so that's what we're going to do now is move it off to the ZFS array on the FreeNAS Mini. But thankfully, listener whom, aka Sean in the chat room, had a copy of it from the live stream. So we were able to use that. But so if you noticed, last week's episode was a little low resolution. That's why, because it was a backup copy of the show. So we never missed a beat, Alan. It was so close. We flirted with death.
Wow.
What was I going to do?
That was very close.
I know. What was I going to do?
You don't have... Oh, man.
Well, the array goes, and the problem is the files are so large that we almost didn't really want to put them on the NAS because...
So this is like the unedited version that you lost?
Right. So like the day we go to edit it, that's the day the array didn't mount. Which is like Wednesday, I think, or something like that. Yeah. It was crazy.
Well, because those original files, are they uncompressed?
Mm-hmm.
Well, see, if you put them on ZFS, if you enable LZ4, you would get a lot of compression.
That might be worth playing with then.
Yeah. Like it'll still be lossless. Like you would gain most of the compression from. Like I know when I was doing the Gorse project to do the 20-year time lapse of the FreeBSD source code tree.
It was nuts.
That one, I think I got like 20-to-1 compression on that.
Whoa, okay.
Although a lot less once I put a background image in it. Even though the background image was static, it made the video that much. My compression dropped to like 5-to-1 or whatever.
So who knows what we get?
Uncompressed video does compress fairly well.
Yeah,
compressed video, like once you put it through lossy compression, then there's not any free compression left really.
Yeah.
But like even the video files I send you, while the video is compressed, the audio is uncompressed to avoid any,
right,
time sync issues.
Right.
And with that, I even get compression. Even I generally stick it in a archive with low compression just to get the free compression on the audio, because it used to make a difference of about 20 minutes or 30 minutes on the upload. Now it probably makes a difference of 1 second. It's more about putting the 6 different files in one container so that it's easier for Rakai to make sure he doesn't miss a segment or something.
Right. Yeah. I am going to play with it. We set up a little experiment with backing it up to the NAS, but the problem is ideally, what I guess what I'm trying to say is, ideally, Apple just needs to get the crap together and have a decent file system on their...
Well, there is...
I know.
ZFS on OS, or OpenZFS on OS X.
That crossed my mind, too.
But it's a port of the ZFS on Linux, so it's that much further behind, right? Because it takes a while for stuff from OpenZFS to get in ZFS on Linux, and then even longer to get in OpenZFS on OS X. But, it's ZFS and it works.
It's painful, Alan. It's painful.
But really, I guess you do probably need more than 100 megabytes a second.
Yeah, about 120.
Video edit.
Yeah.
Well, 120 is right on the ragged edge of what a gigabit can do.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about experimenting with that too. Is just writing it over the LAN.
Yeah. Because then you wouldn't have to have I've switched to that for my PC here. Like I have two 240 gig SSDs mirrored as my OS.
Yeah.
And then everything other than like the OS and a couple of applications that are picky or whatever.
Like your documents and settings and everything's over the network?
Yeah, like all my business files and stuff all sit on ZFS.
Huh.
See, the original plan was actually to create a ZVol and iSCSI mount it into Windows and format it NTFS.
Yeah.
But then I was like, well, I can just do a network mount over SMB, and that worked very well.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a lot to play with. I did a little bit so I'd used the downtime we had on Thursday from last week while you were out of town to experiment with different solutions. And I mean, we've got a different, and thankfully, Whom had a good backup too, which worked out and saved our bacon. But yeah.
I think we're still recording everything you published to us, although it's
Oh, really? Well, I didn't
a little
even know.
disorganized. Well, remember we were experimenting with it the other week, and I'm
Oh, you just never turned it off?
right. I'm waiting for our programmer is supposed to be making a new version of the recording app that will do the thing I want it to do, so that it'll give us nice hourly chunks instead of based on when you start and stop broadcasting.
Right.
Although the advantage to doing it start to stop broadcasting is that you usually reset the stream before each show, and so it would be broken up better than giving you the three
Possibly, yeah.
1 hourly chunks that the time the show was covered from.
It's possible. Yeah.
But the nice thing about that is it's bit for bit exactly what you sent to the live stream. Now, that's not as high quality as what you record locally, but...
Right. It would be a little bit higher.
Yeah.
That's interesting. All right, well, we'll talk more.
But yeah, fun stuff anyway.
Yeah.
We'd have to see.
So that was my fun while you were out. So I can't wait to hear how your trip went. But we're going to save that for the feedback segment. We have a great feedback segment this week. But I think we're going to start with sort of a combo of a couple of big things that happened, right?
Now, everybody's expecting me to go into Shellshock. And I'm like, okay, we have to cover it because it happened. And it would be good for me to explain how it happened. But there was another related bug. And then really interesting thing if you could mix the two together.
Yeah.
And so I decided to cover it all as one story.
Okay. Very good. And plus, by now, everybody's heard of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So obviously the first one is Shellshock, right? A bug in Bash that exploited the entire internet.
Yeah, the entire internet was freaking out about that. You're right.
It was very interesting to actually be at a FreeBSD conference when this was happening.
I bet it was.
Because I was in the room with like the security officer and a couple other people that were talking about it, and like the people responsible for building the packages for FreeBSD. And like, we have a build underway right now. We were going to cancel that, get these bash patches in, and then rebuild everything so that the package update that goes out the next day or whatever will have the bash patch, so everybody can get the bash via the binary updates and so on, and a bunch of stuff like that. And then it's like, oh, well, guess what? There's actually this other flaw going on at the same time, and we should probably push that patch for that one too. And then they get the build started for the bash one, and it's like, oh, turns out the patch doesn't actually fix it. We need this other patch too.
So you were watching them struggle with this sort of in real time?
A little bit.
Wow.
And hearing about some of the other stuff. And then a couple days later, I heard about this next thing at the conference as well, because, a bunch of people there using Amazon and so on. And yeah, it was just interesting to see from the inside what was happening as well.
I was wondering when this was going down, because obviously people were talking to me like, are you guys going to talk about this on TechSNAP? And I was thinking, Alan must be seeing something very fascinating from his perspective right now. So that is really... So did they seem very freaked out by it? Did they seem to think it was a big deal to them?
Yes and no. Obviously, FreeBSD doesn't ship with Bash by default.
Right,
so
right. There's less of urgency.
Although, if you install KDE or GNOME or anything, you end up with Bash.
Oh, okay.
On my web server, which I have customers access, and also the video storage servers for Scale Engine, we do install Bash because customers that are used to Linux are more used to Bash, and they just won't run into these weird issues where they're like, well, why doesn't that work? Or why doesn't this work?
Right.
Also, years ago, the plain SH in FreeBSD wasn't set up so the arrow keys worked by default. It is now, but
yeah.
that was a big enough reason to get most people to
like, that's it, I'm switching back.
I use TCSH, but anyway,
okay.
Only for an interactive shell. All my scripts are written in plain bin sh. But anyway, so let's start at the top, I guess. So there was a critical flaw that was discovered in the Bash shell, which is used as the default system shell on most versions of Linux, as well as OS X. It's not on all versions of Linux. Debian uses Dash and so on, but a lot of Linuxes have Bash as a default shell, and most of them that even the ones that don't usually have Bash installed anyway as an option. I've
always had it on all of mine.
Yeah. The flaw was in the parsing of environment variables. So, people, I assume, are familiar with environment variables. Basically, it's a variable you can set, and then you can use it in your command prompt or your scripts or whatever. And it's basically a way to pass information from your shell down into other programs. Like which program, there's a variable called pager that tells it which program do you want other programs to use when they need to break information, like a man page, up into one-page segments, so you can scroll up and down and so on. Or there's one called editor. So when you run your cron tab -e or whatever command, vi sudo, whatever you want to do, it tells it which editor you want to use, whether that's vi or nano or Emacs or whatever you want to use as your editor. But they're also used for passing information from program to program. So, for example, CGI scripts, which are a way for a web server to basically execute a program to decide the result, right? Originally, web servers just returned files off the disk, but then they got smarter and did, you could have interactive stuff, right? You submit a form and the program would take that information and do something with it. And that's where CGI came from. So if you wrote a CGI script in Bash, the problem is that the way the web server would send information to Bash about the user was via environment variables, right? So all the headers, like what browser the person was using, what their IP address was, what file they wanted, all that would be passed to Bash via environment variables. So the way the flaw worked was that you can set an environment variable, x equals Chris or whatever, or x equals 100, but you can also set it to be a function so that it'll execute a little block of code. The problem is if after that function you put a semicolon, which normally in Bash is the separator, so you can run, for example, if you want to do two things in Bash, you can do first thing, semicolon, second thing, and it'll do the first one and then do the second one.
Right.
Well, because of a flaw in the code, if you did a function, x equals some function, semicolon, some command, when it processed that, it would create the function, set the value of x to be that function, and then it would execute whatever you put after the semicolon. So if someone connected to one of these CGI scripts with their browser user agent set to, Mozilla Firefox, blah, 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 semicolon, rm-rf/, it would run that command. Which obviously would be bad.
So you could actually, just to recap what he's saying, is you could put a command in the user agent string, essentially, that you wanted executed.
And every time you visited a website that had one of these CGI scripts that used Bash, it would run that command.
Amazing.
The other interesting thing at the conference was being there with other people who run large web clusters and stuff, just tailing their logs and seeing all the things people were trying to do.
Yes. Yeah, that was what I was hearing, is people were seeing in their logs that once it became public, it so quickly was people just threw together some scripts and just started checking stuff. And there was everything from legitimate researchers to people that are just trying to find things they could bang on, and it was just filling logs immediately.
The most popular one, obviously, was to get a reverse shell. So what you'd do is the command you would give it would actually make that computer connect back to your computer or some server of yours or something, and then give you access to it so you could then interactively write as many commands as you want and take over the machine.
Wow.
Gonzalez points out that the bash bug is actually very similar to SQL injection, except for you're actually injecting a command. I remember when you used to be able to do this to Windows web servers, IIS, it used to be really popular to see URLs with blah, 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 command, do this.
Yep.
Is very similar to that. I've never actually thought of it that way, but that's a good way to explain it.
Yeah.
So then, after people became aware that, all my CGIs that are written in Bash are a problem. But then people came to realize that after everybody that was using Bash for the CGI scripts went around, running around like chickens with their heads cut off, other people came to realize that even if your CGI script was actually written in Perl or C or anything else, if it happened to fork a shell to do something by using like the system call or something like that, the environment would be passed to that shell.
Right.
So even if you had a regular Perl script, if you were then calling system, ls this or create a symbolic link or do any shell command, what it's actually doing is starting Bash and feeding it that command to run.
And Bash
is seeing these environment variables.
Right, and it just takes them.
It
just accepts it.
Yeah. Now, so part of the problem here is that, web servers and stuff could do more validation of that before they feed it to the shell. But the problem is that the shell shouldn't be vulnerable to this.
Mm-hmm.
One of the really interesting things is that Bash has been vulnerable since version 1.7, which is more than 15 years old.
Yeah, I've heard some
This flaw
estimates.
has existed in Bash for more than 15 years, and nobody has accidentally come across it. Which is quite amazing.
Yeah, I read it could be even longer than that. So
Yeah.
it's well, and at first you could see how some people. I mean, it's a feature, and then they just didn't look
I wouldn't
into
say
it.
so much a feature, but yeah, it's something that most people wouldn't have done, or if you did do it accidentally, what you put after the semicolon would have been invalid or something, and it would have just thrown an error and fixed it. You didn't realize what was actually happening.
Yes.
That every time you started Bash, it was execing this stuff instead of just setting it for you to use later.
Right.
And then as more people spent brain cycles thinking of creative ways to exploit the bug, it was realized that, you could also exploit mail servers like Qmail with it. If a user had a .qmail file, you can set up forwarding in mail servers. So you put a pipe and then a command, and it will push that the email into that command. So that's how our help desk works, a scale engine. You email an address, and then that email gets fed into a program, which then creates a ticket and sends out some emails and stuff. But if your default shell on the system is Bash, then the mail server is going to start Bash to run that command. And it's going to set up a bunch of environment variables to tell Bash and the program that Bash is going to run, here's the person that sent the email, here's where it's going to, here's the the subject and all the other header stuff in an email is passed to Bash and then to the program through environment variables. So if you send an email with a from address that has this code in it and it gets forwarded to a program and the system happens to use Bash as its shell, exploit it.
I also another favorite one of mine was people exploiting it via DHCP, which I thought was pretty clever.
Yes, apparently the DHCP client on Mac OS X, at least, and maybe other places, uses Bash to do some of the stuff. So if in DHCP you give out an IP address, but you also have all these option fields where includes things like which router to use, what DNS servers to use, and there's lots of them that people don't use very often. Well, if you put the Bash string into one of those, then any machine, like say a MacBook, that associated with an access point or just got asked for an IP address from your DHCP server would then run this code, probably as a privileged user, unlike the web server, which is usually runs as a non-privileged user.
Mm-hmm. The DHCP settings.
The DHCP server has to be able to change the IP address of the system. Luckily, the DHCP client on FreeBSD runs with Capsicum and loses the ability to do a bunch of things like that.
Nice, yeah.
But in general, it could cause all kinds of problems.
Especially on sounds like Mac OS.
Yeah, and so just means that I could, you saw that thing I had at Linux Fest Northwest, little USB powered Wi-Fi router like this big, like half the size of a deck of cards. I could have it, set up, tell it all the machines that, you should join the Windows domain blah or something. And then the DHCP client is going to run Bash to parse that or something.
Right.
And
you could bring.
I just sit in a coffee shop and watch
Love the
all
coffee
the
shop.
poor little MacBooks get pwned.
Yeah, you could bring it and just set it up, bring it to the coffee shop. Love the coffee shop example because everybody's looking for a little internet connectivity while they sip on their coffee so they can be productive. Yep. Or the airport, anywhere people have time to burn and want to be productive, you set up a Wi-Fi access point that's doing that.
And you just own their MacBooks.
Mm-hmm. It'll probably work for a while too.
Yep. And we mentioned FreeBSD doesn't come with Bash by default, but you can end up installing it, so you would have to update. PCBSD includes Bash so that people switching from Linux, it's not the default, but if you're used to Linux, you can choose it as your shell when you're creating the user. FreeNAS also comes with Bash for the same reason, so that when you're using the interactive shell, it's more familiar to people that are used to Linux. So while both of those are not really vulnerable, they've both been updated so that you can grab the update and make sure that you get rid of the vulnerable version of Bash in case someone comes up with some other clever way to use this that might be able to compromise those.
I was talking with the head of the Fedora project, and he said that Red Hat and Fedora boxes that have turned on SE Linux, they need to update, but it helped mitigate this problem as well.
Cool. Other interesting thing is a number of VMware products are vulnerable to this because they use
Oh.
Bash for a bunch of
Oh,
stuff.
right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially the ESX server.
Yep. So VMware is rushing around trying to get patches out for at least 4 of their products.
It's a scramble, Alan. It's a good old fashioned scramble.
Also, OpenVPN has been found to be vulnerable in certain situations, and so
Yeah.
they're working on an update for that.
Yeah.
Or specifically, if you're running OpenVPN, you want to make sure you update your Bash.
Yeah, and I guess what was it like if you have your OpenVPN where it runs gosh, I'm forgetting the details now, but there's actually a scenario where the user can define some variables when they're connecting to the OpenVPN server, and those variables could execute Bash commands.
And also the server can say, "Hey, clients, when you connect, run this code so that it sets up your default routes or whatever."
Yeah.
So especially if you say using some shady VPN provider, they might make your machine do stuff you didn't want them to do. So in the show notes, I've also included an example of the Bash exploit and how easy it is.
Ooh.
So in this one, basically, you create a variable. You assign the variable x to the value of basically a function that does nothing, right? It's just like a function with no name, and the contents is literally just a colon and then a semicolon, which just means do nothing, followed by a semicolon and then echo vulnerable. So if your Bash version is vulnerable, when you start Bash, it will then say vulnerable every time you start Bash. And then you run Bash echo this is a test. So if your machine's not vulnerable, it'll say this is a test. If it is vulnerable, it'll say vulnerable, this is a test. And you'll see that while you're trying to do something, it'll actually end up doing something else in addition to what you were trying to do.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Nice and clean. So this is part of an overall coverage, though. It's not just Shellshock.
Yes, we'll get to that in just a second.
Okay.
So Ars Technica was following the story, and they have a huge number of posts on it.
Yeah,
as
they
the
do.
situation evolved.
I was showing some of these.
I guess it started on Wednesday or so, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
The 24th, or even before that. Yeah, it's been going a while. So yeah, I think it was the 24th or so on Wednesday. That's when I started hearing about it. But the first one is, bug in Bash shell creates big security hole on anything that runs Linux.
Mm-hmm.
And then concern over Bash bug grows as it is actively being exploited in the wild. I know Akamai, one of the big CDNs, was getting reamed with it.
That was one of the first places I saw making the most noise about it, actually.
Well, it's because they were actively, because they use Bash, they were getting owned quite badly, apparently.
Yeah.
On top of just because they host so many big sites, all the botnets were pounding on them pretty hard.
Mm-hmm.
And then first Bash patch doesn't solve problem. Second patch rushed out to resolve the issue. That complicated it even more is that when the patch finally came out, people thought they were patched and they weren't.
Right.
And just, the fact that there's a cycle to get a patch out and then having to, call that back or do it another patch just complicates things more. And then the next one, now that people are looking, even more bugs in Bash found and fixed, right? After people looked into how did this go unnoticed for so long, they found a bunch more different vulnerabilities in Bash, which complicates it even more. And this is why we have those CVE numbers for each bug so that we can make sure that, you can't just call it the Bash bug because there are now, 8 different Bash bugs in the last 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to make sure that you're actually patched against all of those and so on. And then Shellshock fixes result in another round of patches as attackers get more clever. They even, as people evolve the attack to try different things, they found even more problems. And then finally, this week, Apple released their patch so that your MacBook doesn't get owned from associating with a rogue DHCP server.
Right. Trev D in the chat room says there's currently 6 CVEs assigned to Bash this flaw. So there you go.
Yeah. And, lots of crazy. And I'm sure there'll be a bunch more over the next couple of weeks.
So
as well.
you get updates for Mavericks, Mountain Lion, and Lion. So 3 versions of OS 10 are being updated with this.
And older ones are screwed.
Out of luck.
Yeah. But it really goes to show that, Bash is in everything, basically. And it turns out this bug's probably been there since 1994. And nobody's noticed it. Because it's not somewhere people are looking for vulnerabilities very often, I don't think.
Right.
But they are going to be now.
Yeah, and we have an email that kind of goes into that aspect of it too. In the
And the
feedback
other
sheet.
thing is it just goes to show that a lot of like fuzz testing is not happening, right? People aren't. There's no automated system that's going through and saying, well, what happens if I stick this as the input and this and until you make it do something you wouldn't expect, and then be like, hey, somebody needs to look at that and make sure that's not bad.
Is the machine we've all created too complex for us to manage, Alan?
It's hard to say. But it just seems that a lot of times stuff's been, build it and we'll fix the security later if it matters.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds us, no matter how popular an open source project is, it still has to be reviewed constantly. And maybe we're just seeing a lot more of that happen
And also
now.
just that concept of, many eyeballs makes all bugs shallow or whatever only works if all those eyeballs are actually looking for bugs, right? Just because it's open source and lots of people use it doesn't mean that lots and lots of people are reading the source code.
Yeah.
That's kind of the difference there. Is that just because it's popular and open source doesn't mean people aren't looking at it. Or it doesn't mean that people are looking at it. Or that doesn't mean that the people looking at it are on the good side.
And you never know. When something's been around for this long, maybe somebody did know about it. Just didn't say anything.
But we didn't see that in the logs until recently, so
Right.
I wouldn't say there was
Nothing
basically-
widespread. No.
Yeah.
No, yeah. Okay, well, so that's Shellshock. Anything else on Shellshock?
There was also not so much on Shellshock, but
Okay.
there was also a critical update at the same time that I heard about at BSDCon or EuroBSDCon was a critical update to NSS, which is Mozilla's cryptography library, which apparently was not doing proper validation on SSL certificates. If I remember correctly, it was only comparing the fingerprint and not some other part of the certificate that it needed to.
Oh, really?
I think like the host name or something, which meant that you could make a certificate that would end up having the same fingerprint but be for a different site, and Chrome and Firefox would accept that certificate thinking it was valid, even though it was actually not for the site you would expect it to be.
Lovely.
Because the fingerprints matched.
Yeah.
And so that one also would go around the certificate pinning, right? Because it says, this site would only ever have this certificate with this fingerprint. And so, if you see anything else, complain.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, it would mean that it would still pass that check as well because the whole point was getting the same fingerprint. So that was another big update that kind of got buried under all the bash stuff.
Yeah, I remember seeing the package come down, but I didn't really hear much coverage on it.
Yeah. That one was really a hot topic at EuroBSDCon because NSS was supposed to also be having that update that did the
Netflix.
HTML5
Yeah,
DRM and
yeah,
Netflix. And we're all like, yes, Netflix, let's make that happen.
Right.
But the other big patch, which came a couple days later, was Xen. I guess
Yes.
that was actually released today or yesterday.
The embargo came off today. The patch was given to big vendors on the 26th.
Right. So Xen, which is a hypervisor, kind of like VirtualBox or VMware or whatever, and they announced that they announced to a number of public cloud providers like Amazon and Rackspace that, hey, there's this vulnerability, and basically, we're supposed to give the virtual machine access to 256 of these MSRs, but we accidentally were giving them access to 1024 of them.
Ooh.
And if you try to write to the extra ones, it's basically a no-op and doesn't happen, so it's not a big deal. But you can read them, and it will end up reading memory out of a different virtual machine. So this means that if I have root on virtual machine A, I could read the memory of virtual machine B and C that happen to be running on the same physical machine as my machine. So I could spin up an instance at Amazon and start reading the memory out of other people's Amazon instances.
That's bad.
Possibly getting, private keys for SSL or, SSH or passwords or anything that's in memory, right?
That's super bad.
Yeah. And this affects all versions of Xen, starting with 4.1 to everything up to today. But it doesn't affect Xen on ARM because the hardware implementation is different and it doesn't do it the same way, and so it didn't have the problem. Although the Xen on ARM is fairly new, and I don't think there's that many people using it. Only the ARM v15 or whatever actually has hypervisor support anyway. But so Amazon and Rackspace basically had to do a mass reboot and not explain in detail why. So they had to tell their customers, hey, we're going to have to reboot a bunch of machines, and that means your VM will go down or whatever. And it's because of a bug, but we can't tell you about it because it's still embargoed.
Yeah, and of course, companies like Rackspace and Amazon, they're all about that uptime, right? So that's got to be
And particularly Rackspace normally, because you're paying quite a premium to use them, is like, oh, well, when there's a maintenance and we have to do it, we'll ask you and let you pick what time is convenient for you for us to do it and so on. And mostly they try to avoid doing stuff on weekends too, right? When you're going to be off. By this time, they're like, well, the embargo expires and we have to get us all done before that. So we're going to have to not do it that way.
Wow.
And so up on their website, I have a link here to their apology saying, sorry, we had to reboot everything without giving you a bunch of notice and coordination, but this had to be done right away before the details of the exploit became available to everybody.
Yeah, the way he described it in his blog post, he said, once the details go public, that's like Rackspace ringing the dinner bell for hackers, and we had to get this fixed first.
Yeah. And Amazon's got a couple blog posts about it as well, and I have the Xen security advisory. Also, the flaw was only exploitable when running fully virtualized guest, which is HVM mode.
Right.
Which uses the processor virtualization features. It doesn't affect para-virtualization mode, which is the one you can use on older processors that don't have the hardware. It's slightly slower and requires running the modified kernel, so it's not as popular anymore, but it was back then. Because of that, and the fact that a lot of stuff on Amazon still uses the old PV mode, only 10% of Amazon instances had to be rebooted.
Yeah.
But this still affected a lot of people.
That shows you how out of date their infrastructure is.
Well, part of it, yeah.
Yeah. So in other words...
but the interesting thing was combining those two. So use the bash bug to take over some machine that's poorly maintained by some guy that doesn't know what he's doing or whatever. Then from his machine, be able to read the memory of a more secure machine that might actually have something you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, this is... So it's two... The Xen vulnerability and the NSS library update and Shellshock are three separate and distinct vulnerabilities that could all work together to give you full access to somebody's machine, and in this case, potentially access to someone's EC2 instance using vulnerabilities that have been in the wild for a really long time. And it's we talk so often about island hopping and privilege escalation. Well, here is a brilliant real-world example.
Jumping between virtual machines, even though you're not supposed to be able to normally.
It's kind of interesting, and it's like I think the meta story here is this is the week that you patch your S. Like if your company is stingy and you have a change control process, this is the week you push it through, and this is the week you go to the mat to fight for these patches.
And this is not one of the ones where, because we're running an old bash, we're not vulnerable. It's like, no, you'd have to be running a really old bash not to be vulnerable.
Yeah, I doubt that you're running that old of a bash.
Yeah.
Lots of really good links and resources that Alan has accumulated in the show notes for all of those stories if you guys want to go check them out. Alan, is there anything else on any of those you want to cover?
I think that's enough on that subject.
Wow, I know, right? Okay, well then let's take a breather, and I'll thank Ting for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. Go to techsnap.ting.com. Everybody, techsnap.ting.com. That'll take $25 off your first Ting device. And if you've already got a Ting-compatible device, well, then they'll give you a $25 service credit. If you're like me, that's going to pay for more than your first month. So what the heck is Ting? Well, I'm going to tell you, my friend. Ting is mobile that makes sense. It's my mobile service provider. It's been my mobile service provider for... I've been using them for well over a year now. I've got 3 lines now. I've got 3 lines on Ting, and I'll tell you why. I'm truly, thankfully, so happy not to have to deal with any of the standard carrier BS. First of all, I just like the freedom of knowing I have no contract. That just gives me flexibility. I don't feel like I'm being trapped or conned. Second of all, I'm only paying for what I actually use. My minutes, my messages, and my megabytes. Ting just adds them all up at the end of the month, whatever bucket I fall into. That's what I pay. I'm not paying potentially for 500 minutes and only using 250. I'm not paying for 5 gigabytes of data and only using 2 gigabytes. I'm only paying for what I use. And of course, my Ting plan includes hotspot, tethering, caller ID, picture messaging, all the stuff you'd expect for a flat $6 a month. and then it's just your usage. Plus, they have an incredible dashboard that gives me full power over all 3 lines. I can set up call forwarding, caller ID, deactivate, reactivate lines if I'm not going to use something for a little bit, what to do if I'm out of town, where to forward my calls to, all of that. Alerts, I can break it all out and see how much data I'm using. It has a really nice system that gives you just a heads-up display of where you're at. And on top of that, like if that wasn't enough, they have no-hold customer service. You can call them at 1-855-TING-FTW, and a real Canadian answers the phone. That Canadian is empowered, kind of like Alan's an empowered Canadian, to solve your problems. At 1-855-TING-FTW, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. During business, and they'll answer your calls. I think it's really great. And something else, you go to TechSNAP.ting.com, they're going to give you $25 off any device you want to pick. But Ting is moving between warehouses right now, and they literally would rather just sell you a phone than have to move it. I can understand how they feel about that. So they have crazy deals going on right now, and they have more information on the Ting blog. Go to TechSNAP.ting.com, then click the blog. I'll give you an example. Right now, they have, I talk about this feature phone all the time, the Samsung M400. If you just want a phone that does calls and maybe a little texting if you want that. It's got a camera too, so like if you get in an accident and you need to document something, it'll do the job. So check this out. You can get $30 off right now. You can get $20 in Ting credit and $10 off the price. So that's about 20, that's about $30 if you include the credit. But this is the overall cost of the phone, $60. $60 for a phone with no contract, no early termination, and you only pay for what you use. Probably the best deal on here right now, $94 in savings right now on the Note 3. If you've been eyeing those larger format phones, the Note 3 is a great one. And plus, you're going to get the $20 in Ting credit. And if you go to TechSNAP.ting.com, you'll get $25 in Ting credit. Now you're really, really, really starting to save. Plus, Ting has data-only devices, so if you just need a hotspot and you only want to pay for your usage, it's a really great way to go. TechSNAP.ting.com. Go try out their savings calculator. See what I've been talking about. Put your actual usage in there. And then go look at some of those sales, especially if you want to grab that feature phone. I've been eyeballing. I have days where I just feel like having an anti-technology day where I just want to unplug, but I still need, I'm a dad and I'm married. I want to be in contact. I'm thinking about grabbing that feature phone. And since I only pay for my usage, why not? And that's a really good way to go. Or if you travel from time to time, anything like that. Or you need a business line, or you need to give a line to somebody else, TechSNAP.ting.com. Some really great deals right now while Ting's doing their warehouse move. TechSNAP.ting.com. And a big thanks to Ting for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. Up there in the Canadians like you, Alan.
Yep.
Helping that Canadian economy with that real person support system they've got there. All right, well, our next story takes us down a path that is one of my... Oh man, I hate this boilerplate, language that companies use. Your privacy is very important to us. Just like when you call up, your call is very important to us, and you sit on hold for 20 minutes.
If my call was very important to you, you would answer the bloody phone Ting does.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have no customer service. And trust me, I know all about that right now because our internet's out at my house, and Angela's been on hold all morning.
It's even if it's a big outage, how about changing the prompt at the beginning saying, yes, we realize there's a problem, sorry.
Right.
Here's the latest information. Don't wait on hold for someone to read you that information. We'll give it to you, and you can wait on hold if you need something else or something more.
Seems obvious,
but we won't make you wait on hold if you don't, because this will also improve the experience of customers that are calling about something else.
Clears up the queues.
And so on.
It seems obvious. Now, Brian
and
Krebs,
it will just stop killing the people that work there with just making them read out the same.
Well, and how angry people get
we'll
too.
Be back, whatever. Yes. Exactly.
So we have an article from Brian Krebs. I feel like he's living our pain this week.
Yes.
What's going on?
So he got a letter in the mail from Cox saying, "We value your privacy a lot, but we kind of gave away all your information."
What?
A female employee of Cox Communications, which is a large U.S. ISP, if you're from Europe and have no idea who they are.
Yes, you might want to be wondering who Cox is. That's true.
Yes.
I never thought of
that. Anyway, a female employee was socially engineered into giving up her username and password to someone over the phone, claiming to be from Cox technical support or whatever, from the IT department. These credentials were then used to access the private data of a number of Cox customers. Apparently, the attackers made off with stolen data for 52 customers, one of which was Brian Krebs.
You're kidding.
This makes it sound kind of like a targeted attack. If you're going to break in and you only steal 52 people's information and one of them is Brian Krebs.
Right.
That seems it's like... So the attacker is either someone who is or is not a fan of Brian Krebs.
So you're telling me these guys physically broke in?
No, they logged in over a web portal and accessed customer data.
I was picturing like old
the
school.
username and password they stole from some girl that worked
okay. I'm following. I'm following you.
Yeah, so they called her up on the phone, got her to give away her username and password, which doesn't. When you call Cox, or everything Cox ever sends you always says a Cox employee will never ask you for your password.
Probably.
But apparently, if you ask a Cox employee for their password, they'll just give it up.
A customer will never call asking for your password.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, and so that brought up a number of questions for Brian Krebs, along with, who was this and why are they after me specifically? Because they got quite a bit of, obviously Cox doesn't necessarily know exactly what they got, so they had to list everything that was in the database that they could have gotten. But that included, trying to find it here. There's a whole list. Here it is. Your name, street address, email address, your secret questions and answers, your PIN number, the last 4 digits of your social security number or driver's license, and a bunch of other stuff. And it's like, well, that information about Brian Krebs in the wrong hands could make his life quite painful again, as if he hasn't been targeted enough times.
But they take his privacy very seriously, Alan.
Yes. And of course, they offer credit monitoring from Experian.
Oh, good. Remember, free credit monitoring for a year.
But you're right. But Experian, the company that Brian Krebs found, was actually accidentally, apparently, selling data to identity thieves directly in bulk.
What I love here is they're like, additionally, although your full social security number was not exposed, as a precautionary measure, we are providing you with a free 1-year membership to Protect My ID Elite from ConsumerInfo.com Incorporated, an Experian company. They write it like they're doing him a solid. Like, you're welcome that even though we didn't leak your full social, we're still going to be good guys and get you a free year.
Yeah.
Which you can then pay for automatically when it renews.
So this brings up a number of interesting points. First of all, it appears that the Cox internal customer database can be accessed directly from the internet using only a username and password.
That's true.
So first of all, why isn't it only accessible while you're inside the Cox call center buildings? Via a VPN or something. So even if you want people to work from home or whatever, which doesn't seem likely, but if you're outsourced a call center or something, a couple of VPNs or whatever, but let's not put the people's information directly on the internet. Right?
Yeah.
Also, just a username and password? What about two-factor authentication? So Brian Krebs calls up and goes through a bunch of people, eventually gets to some, PR person, social, the person that's supposed to deal with reporters and such, because he's actually a real reporter from a newspaper originally.
Yeah.
And Cox says that while they do use two-factor authentication in some cases, they weren't using it for this, where all the private data is.
Right.
Yes. If it was Cox's private data, two-factor authentication. But since it's just yours and they really care about your privacy, no two-factor authentication.
Right. They care about it so much that they didn't have time to set up the two-factor authentication.
Why isn't it behind a VPN? Why isn't it only accessible to people that actually need to have it? And why doesn't it have two-factor authentication?
Right.
I don't know the exact text of the privacy laws in the States, but in Canada we have PIPEDA, the Personal Information and Private Documents Act. And it says specifically, only employees that have the need to know should be able to access the customer's private data and so on. It shouldn't be just everybody at the company. And so it's like, why doesn't that apply here? So Brian points out, this sad state of affairs is likely the same across multiple companies that claim to be protecting your personal and financial data. In my opinion, any company, particularly one in the ISP business, that isn't using more than username and password to protect their customers' personal information should be publicly shamed. Cox goes on the TechSNAP Hall of Shame. Wall of Shame, whatever it's called. Unfortunately, most companies will not take proactive steps to safeguard their information until they are forced to do so, usually in response to a data breach. Maybe we'll see other ISPs, because they saw Cox get hacked, to try to at least, deploy something before they're next. But oftentimes we don't see anything happen until this happens. So it's, just like we don't normally see laws preventing other things until somebody dies, right? in this case, until somebody gets hacked, nobody bothers trying to protect themselves.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, most companies will not proactively take. Oh, really? Barring any pressure from Congress to find proactive ways to avoid breaches like this one, companies will continue to guarantee the security and privacy of their customers' records one breach at a time.
Yeah, which doesn't work.
So every time they get breached, they promise it won't happen again.
Yeah, of course. Oh, sorry. We're so sorry. And we take your privacy so seriously. Very seriously.
So seriously that we don't do anything about it until it's too late.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Alan, I'm glad he's calling attention to it because it's really become just like this empty platitude.
Especially this one, news of this probably wouldn't have come out if only 52 people were affected and it only happened that one of them happened to be a reporter so that we would find out about it.
Otherwise, we never had heard of it. Never would have known.
Exactly.
Never would. And it probably goes on this kind of stuff all the time. All the time, Alan. Okay. Any other thoughts on that one?
No, that's about it. That one.
Okay.
But yeah, you can go over to Krebs' site if you want to read the letter and
we got it linked in the show notes.
It'd be great to just grab 10 of these letters and see. Literally, it's like 70% of the text is identical across every one of these. I'm
sure at least 70, and then that they probably have some sort of financial arrangement with Experian where there's probably an exchange of money over that, because they're essentially what happens is they're just giving them customers because of privacy laws they can't even sign you up for it, which is probably a good thing. And then so you have to go sign up. But when you sign up, you automatically enter the renewal program where after the free year that you get, they start charging you.
Exactly.
So
it's almost as bad as remember that Network Solutions is like, oh, we've just decided that you're signed up for our $1,700 a year service where we'll make you call us if you want to make a change instead of just letting you make a change.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let me tell you about our friends over at IX Systems. Go to ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. That's how you can support the show and learn more about IX Systems. So, why do we talk about IX Systems all the time? Well, Alan and I trust our infrastructures to IX Systems. That's after years and years and years and years of trying out all the different vendors. And plus, IX Systems has...
Plus, you got stung by not keeping your stuff on an IX box.
That's true. That's very true.
Last week.
That's very true. And in fact, and now our solution is to write those files off to the IX FreeNAS Mini. And I have to tell you, it kind of seems like a no-brainer. And, it's not just, once you have it, it's obvious. But IX Systems really has a process down. They have figured this out. They have some not the best hands-on white glove customer service I have ever experienced. And they've just been, I would almost say, it almost feels like an educational process when I've talked to them. Like, I have learned things every time I've engaged with them in that process. And in most cases, the process of picking out the equipment that I want and determining what equipment will suit my needs is extremely frustrating and a big time
if you've
waste.
ever tried to do, you're like, the website from the manufacturer even only has like some of the specs.
Yeah,
and then you're always trying to make their product seem better than it is. So he's like, what is it actually going to do?
And then when you call them, it's a waste.
It can burst to 600 megabits a second or whatever. But
you can't get the answers from them.
Digital to ask about the hard drive.
No.
And so then and the sales goon at Dell doesn't know anything about anything.
And this is something like you always know this, but then when it becomes a problem, it's when you really need them to come through for you, and it's the biggest problem ever, and that's when you really regret making the wrong choice. And I know you were just out doing some BSD shenanigans. I bet you bumped into a few folks from IX while you're out there.
I think there were like 10 people from IX at the conference.
Representing out there.
The CTO was giving the keynote, actually. Jordan Hubbard, who's the CTO of IX Systems now, was working at Apple before that, and is one of the guys that originally founded the FreeBSD project. And so he gave a quick recap of the last 21 years of it and what he thinks we need to do for the next 10 years to keep going.
Sounds like a good guy to have as the CTO running IX.
Yes, and we're talking about the fact that now even cables run FreeBSD.
Really? How does that happen?
Yes. So there's a video cable that converts from like DVI to HDMI.
Sure.
One of the ones where it's not that specific. I forget what the two ends of the cable are, but it basically has to transcode video on the fly. And so it's got this tiny little embedded chip, and it's running FreeBSD.
Apple's got one of those for the iPhone, where it's inside is a little tiny computer that converts the video on the fly. I wonder if that's the cord.
That might be one of them. But there's, basically they're getting into the computers are in everything now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we have to start looking at stuff
Well,
like
and
that.
you touched on it kind of briefly here, but that's the other really great feature about IX is just the incredible depth of experience that they bring, and not just in the FreeBSD and open source culture aspect, which is huge, and for me, one of probably the most important aspects, especially because I
But
know...
also the hardware side.
Yes, exactly. And that's the magic right there. That's part of the magic.
It's like when you call up the sales guy and he can tell you exactly the difference between this model and this model of the LSI HBA tip for controlling your disks and stuff, and just the fact that they have their partnership with Supermicro is so close that their plans are across the road from each other. Like IX is like, well, we're going to partner up with Supermicro, so why don't we move into the building across the road from them? Right? And then they have partnerships with LSI, and LSI is like, well, we have this new product and we want it to work on FreeBSD because lots of people are using it for ZFS. Hey, IX, would you like helping us out? And it's like, so they're beta drivers for the new 12 gig per second stuff on FreeNAS, and actually it's out of beta now. They're the official drivers.
And
then Western Digital, their partnership with Western Digital is so close that next month, November 1st and 2nd, Meet BSD, which is run by IX Systems, will be hosted at the headquarters of Western Digital in San Jose, California.
That's who I want to buy my storage from right there. I mean, that's just that's so awesome. And the great thing is I during the week that Shellshock had come out, I was exchanging emails with them, and they were on top of it immediately. They were on top of it instantly. So that's awesome from that standpoint too. My FreeNAS.
Well, they actually IX employs the deputy security officer for FreeBSD.
There you go. So that's what we're saying. You see how that works? ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. Go check them out. And go grab that white paper, too, if you're having a hard time making the jump, maybe, or you're having a hard time convincing somebody.
Yeah. If you have to convince somebody else and they expect a fancy flyer with pictures, here's a fancy flyer with pictures.
There you go.
It's even nicer than the one from Dell.
There you go. All right, Alan, let's move on to the topic. Revisiting of the topic, I should say, of bad USB. The code's out there, Alan. Watch out.
Yeah.
Watch out.
So we originally talked about bad USB back after Black Hat.
Yeah.
When researchers Karsten Knoll and Jakob Lell from SR Labs in Germany presented their thing, and it was, hey, look we reprogrammed the firmware on this USB stick, so when you plug it in, it pretends to be a keyboard and types out a shell script and runs it on your machine, whether it's Windows or Mac or Linux or whatever. And then it's like, oh, that's pretty scary. And they talked about it some, but they didn't release any of their code. But after that, researchers Brandon Wilson and Adam Codell were like, well, hey, we were working on something like that. And after they saw the talk, they decided to accelerate their work, and they've now posted their code on GitHub.
Oh.
So they managed, they picked one specific USB memory stick that they could get cheap from a manufacturer in Taiwan. And it's fairly ubiquitous, and they've hacked it so that it can do this.
Oh, okay.
And they've posted the code to show how to do it.
Oh, good.
So the problem is that Knoll and Lell, and then Codell and Wilson, were not exploiting vulnerabilities in USB. They were just taking advantage of weaknesses in the manner in which USB devices are supposed to behave. Right? So it's not that there's something wrong with the USB standard or anything. It's just that we've kind of been making assumptions all these years. So the way USB works is you plug in a device, and then it tells your computer, I am this type of device, right? I'm a USB mass storage device, right, which is a USB stick. Or, I'm a webcam, or I'm a keyboard, or a mouse, or whatever. And this has allowed us to do some interesting things, right? You plug your phone in, and it can pretend to be a USB stick and give you access to the SD card.
Mm-hmm.
Or I have a KVM for my servers, and it's got one USB port, and it pretends to be a USB hub that then has attached to it a keyboard, a mouse, and a USB CD-ROM drive, which can then actually let me mount a CD over the network.
Yeah.
And or even, my webcam. It pretends to be a webcam and a sound card so it can provide a microphone.
Mm-hmm.
Or this microphone pretends to be a microphone and a sound card, or it pretends to be a whole sound card because it has a monitor port that it can play back and record. And, that's allowed these USB composite devices that can be multiple things. The problem is that we just trust what the device says and let it do whatever it wants. All right. So at DerbyCon, Brendan and Adam were able to demonstrate their attack with a device pretending to be a keyboard that typed out a predetermined script once it was plugged into the host computer. They also showed another demo where they had made a hidden partition on a flash drive that was completely undetectable on the host PC. So you plug the flash drive in, and it would look like it was so big and would have a partition on it, and you could write files to it. But there's actually a second partition you couldn't see, which it could be keylogging or doing whatever it wanted. That partition could be full of code, or it could be empty and be used to steal information from your computer that could then be retrieved later by physically taking that USB stick. And they said it's completely undetectable while it's happening. The PC has no way of determining the difference between the fact that that's a USB stick versus the fact that it's not a keyboard, like it's claiming
Right. It has no way to know.
Exactly. The way a PC determines the type of devices all happens through the USB, and the code is on the device you're plugging in, not in the computer or the USB controller. So you just trust whatever the device claims to be. Our ability to control that code means that you cannot trust anything a USB device tells you. And so, there's a couple of possible ways around this. You could go with code signing.
Mm-hmm.
So the USB stick would only allow the firmware to be overwritten by a new firmware that was signed from the same manufacturer. But, people don't probably want to lose the ability to modify the firmware if they want it, right? It's my device. I own this USB stick. I should be able to put whatever firmware I want on it.
True.
But at the same time, I don't want someone else putting their firmware on it. So it's kind of a catch-22 in that case.
Mm-hmm.
However, the other thing is, at the same time, a real solution would actually be the operating system and the users to evolve to no longer trust random USB devices. Kind of the thing I would envision is like when you plug a USB device in, you get a pop-up similar to what you get when you try to install an app under like Android saying, this device claims it does this, this, and this, or it's trying to present this, this, and this device, and it could do these things. So if you plug in a USB stick, and then it says, this device is a USB mass storage and a network card.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, that's
it's
not a
not.
network card. I'm going to not let that do that because, it could pretend to be a USB network adapter and expose a fake network interface and, provide DHCP on that and change your DNS settings so that you would be going through rogue DNS servers and get man-in-the-middle attacked.
Or shell-shock you with the DHCP vector.
Yeah.
Hilarious.
Or, it could do all kinds of things like
That'd be so
with a hidden partition. It could pretend to be a microphone and try to record stuff, or it could do all kinds of different things.
That is interesting. Vulcan Writer in the chat room's pointing out on the iPhone when you plug in an unknown USB device, it'll say, this is claiming to be this. Do you want to allow it? So they have the ability to do it. They just don't do it.
So basically by default, to make things easy, we've always done, USB is plug and play. You just plug it in and it works. You don't have to do anything. Remember Windows was auto run for a long time where there's a USB stick with a little text file on it.
Or CD-ROM even. Just stick the CD-ROM in.
Yeah. So it was originally made for CD-ROMs, but it happened to work on USB sticks. You put a little autorun.inf on it, and you could make it automatically execute a virus as soon as the USB stick was plugged in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Luckily, they've kind of toned that back a bit, but you can see how that's also a problem. And so, we're going to have to evolve to not trust USB devices and give
USB
users a lot more control over them.
USB was such a response to trying to make it easier for consumers. It was a response to SCSI connectors and parallel ports and all that.
Right, because with SCSI, you had to assign each device a unique ID, and you'd have to know what the other IDs were, and it was too complicated for regular people.
So that's why things like
USB has been great, but
that's why they did it like this.
Yeah.
And that's also where autorun came from. It was too hard to tell users how to start the setup.exe program.
You'd have to run dcorn/setup.exe.
It's
like, but I have two hard drives, so my CD-ROM drive isn't dcorn.
Right. So on your computer it's E, but on her computer it's D, and it was. Yeah. And now this is the legacy that we have that we pay for.
Yeah. But really, code signing is really not going to be the answer because even if we did code signing or whatever, I could order 1,000 USB sticks with my own firmware on them, and the manufacturer would just make it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Take the money.
Yeah.
So the code signing would only prevent me from, say, stealing your USB stick that you trust and modifying the firmware to do something evil and then returning it without you knowing and then you plugging it in. It's probably easier to just buy the same USB stick and modify it or something rather than trying to steal yours, modify it, and put it back, unless you're a government or something. But
Well, I mean, that's the other thing is if it could always happen in manufacturing, and then what are you going to do? Interesting. So bad USB, a little bit closer to reality is what you're telling me.
Well, there's code out there. You can do it with a certain USB stick, and I'm sure that with that code, a bunch of people will be able to expand that to cover different USB sticks as well.
Right, exactly.
And, like we said, we've talked about virus persistence before. Like we've seen a network where they hacked in and installed the virus on the printer so that even after they cleaned the computers, they would just get reinfected because the printer wouldn't be disinfected because people wouldn't think to look at the printer. Well, you could do the same thing by hiding a virus in the webcam, right? So the virus gets installed on your computer, it reflashes the firmware on the webcam, and now even after you clean out the computer, you reformat it, you nuke everything, reflash the BIOS even, you plug that USB camera back, that webcam back into it, and it gets reinfected.
Wow, that's pretty nuts.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, Alan. Good to hear.
So,
I guess it's good to know it's out there, and it was something that was
see some interesting stuff over the next couple of years as we have to learn to control USB.
And I think it's funny because the first time we covered it, it seems like this could definitely be a problem, but it was definitely in the theory realm. I mean, you could see like some specific uses, whereas people had written specific code. Now we have a little more specific use case, but it's publicly available code that could be modified. At that point, it seems like it's game on now.
Exactly. So, it comes down to people having access to the USB stick or something. But yeah, basically it's the point where the virus gets on your computer via browser exploit or whatever, and then it can persist by hiding in all your little devices. We've also talked about the ones like, what was it, the one? Because your graphics card has access to DMA, the direct memory access, they were using the RAM on the graphics card to record your keystrokes and then send them later when you weren't looking. Or the fact that network cards for high speed now have their own processors and stuff, and so the virus could actually run in there. So it'd be completely undetectable because it wouldn't even be touching the operating system you're running. It would only be running on the network card and then capturing the keys at the hardware level and then siphoning them off and sending packets out over the network card without ever having gone through your system.
See, this is the reason I'm switching to Thunderbolt. No more bad USB for me, and I'm not using any more video cards.
The same.
I'm going back to a console.
The same thing on Thunderbird by just replacing the firmware again.
Oh, dang. Actually, Thunderbolt has a ton of security issues.
And it's the PCI cards and so on that have the DMA access.
Yeah, so does Thunderbolt.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why in OpenBSD they purposely disable FireWire because it gave you DMA access. In FreeBSD they used the FireWire for debugging because it had DMA access.
Yeah, I mean it works both ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I was mentioning earlier that we had that backup copy of our live stream from viewer Sean, and you know how he did it? Using his DigitalOcean droplet. There's so many things you can use a DigitalOcean droplet for. So let me tell you a little bit about DigitalOcean. It is amazing. And this is what Sean did. He spun up a DigitalOcean droplet and he got it all set up for us. And it was pretty amazing. And if you're not familiar with DigitalOcean, I'd love to tell you a little bit about them because there's probably a problem they could solve for you too. It's simple cloud hosting. And they're dedicated to offering the most intuitive and easy way for you to spin up your own cloud server. Users can create a cloud server in less than 55 seconds. And they have pricing plans that start at only $5 a month for 512 megabytes of RAM, a 20 gigabyte SSD, 1 CPU, and a terabyte of transfer connected to Tier 1 bandwidth. DigitalOcean has data centers in New York, San Francisco, Singapore, Amsterdam, and London. And I know some of our TechSNAP audience members out there love themselves some data center porn. Check out the DigitalOcean Instagram feed. They posted some pictures from inside one of their data centers. It's so awesome. But really, what's even more incredible is their interface.
Yep.
It is very simple. It is very intuitive, and power users can replicate it with their awesome API. They have an API that lets you take some of this functionality and really blow it up. You can integrate it with things like Puppet and Chef, and you can really get some management capabilities, but you can also get visibility for alerting and things like that. And DigitalOcean is doing something else that's really awesome. Their community is growing like crazy because it's such a great service. And they have these tutorials, and DigitalOcean wants to set the bar higher than anyone else. They want to make sure that these are the best tutorials on the web. So check out what they're doing. They're going to pay authors up to $100 to $200 for technical tutorials. Potential writers can submit a writing sample before they become a tutorial writer. You can learn more about the program by going over to do.co/AHA. That's do.co/capital A, lowercase h, A. And you can become a paid writer. do.co/capital A, lowercase h-a, $100 to $200. If there is a subject matter that you are an expert on, why not go over to DigitalOcean, submit them a sample, see if they like it. And there's some great ones up there right now you can check out as well. Go to digitalocean.com/community to get an idea of some of the ones that have been submitted. And remember, at $5 a month, you can get a hell of a cloud server that you power on your own. Mm-hmm. And we have a promo code to get you a $10 credit. Now, we are in the transition between September and October. So you can try Snap September, all lowercase. I'll also have Snap October activated soon, so that should work depending on when you're hearing this. Try either one. I bet Snap September will work for a while, and that'll get you a $10 credit. Well, like I mentioned, DigitalOcean's only $5 a month. That means for 2 months, you can play with a DigitalOcean droplet and see what it can do for you. Try out CoreOS. Put CentOS up on there and toss on the LAMP stack. And by the way, they'll get you going even faster with their one-click installations. It's really great. You can take advantage of containerization if you need to. They can make that really easy with deployments using Doku. It's great. And that interface will get you up and running in no time. DigitalOcean.com. Promo code SNAPSeptember, or depending on when you're listening to this, Snap October. And you get that $10 credit. Try it out for free. And remember, they're also taking those tutorials, do.co/A, lowercase h-a. And you can get up to paid up to $200 if you have a great tutorial. And that's DigitalOcean's commitment to trying to get the content quality up there really high, and they recognize to do that, they're going to have to pay people to get that. And I think it's really neat they're willing to take that step. DigitalOcean.com, Snap September when you check out. And a big thanks to DigitalOcean for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. Alan, is there anything else we want to cover in the news segment? Well, I will mention before we jump into our huge feedback that episode 57 of BSD Now is out. Go check it out. The Demon's Apprentice, which is probably a great episode. I would imagine. I haven't seen it yet because it was literally just posted while we were yakking. So you can go, if you want more Alan, you can go get that downloading because now we're going to jump into the rest of the show. It's like the halfway point, so it's a good time to get your download started. All right, Alan, with the news all done, that means it's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to TechSNAP@JupiterBroadcasting.com or popping that contact link at the top of the Jupiter Broadcasting website, or even better, starting a thread in our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv. And before we get to the emails, we got to hear how your trip went. So, Alan, you just got back from EuroBSDCon 2014, and it sounds like I know there was some eating and other shenanigans going down.
Yes, it was great. I got there Wednesday afternoon. Got checked in my hotel, relaxed a little bit, and then met up with people, and we kind of organized an impromptu dinner. A bunch of us kind of congregated in the lobby, and then Sean Bruno was like, well, there's like 14 of us, so we can't just show up at a restaurant. So we went and talked to the guy at the front desk, and they called a couple of places and found a place that could take all of us, and the guy drew on a map for us, and Sean navigated us to this place successfully, and we all went and had dinner, and it was great. And Thursday and Friday were Dev Summit, so we did FreeBSD meetings all day with all the developers. We talked about what FreeBSD 11 is going to look like. We took the conversation and all the notes we had from BSDCan back in March and looked at, of the things we said we want to have done for FreeBSD 11, how far have we gotten? And, now that there's going to be officially blessed by Oracle Java for FreeBSD, so it's actually going to be supported by Oracle. Lots of other features that are finished now and ones that are well underway and a bunch of other stuff. And it was great. And then we had organized dinners on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So on Thursday and Friday, we all loaded up on a bus and we're taken off to a nice restaurant with a set menu, so your food just come and you ate. It was nice.
Oh, that is nice. I like that. As long as it's good food.
There were over 100 of us on Thursday night, and then by the Saturday night one, which is once it's running to the actual conference, not just the invite-only part. By then, with the 225 people that were at the conference, plus a bunch of people had, wives and family with them. I think there were 250 some odd people at dinner there.
Wow.
We had like a ballroom.
So people bring their family to some of these.
Yes. Well, if you're going to go to Bulgaria, you might
Yeah,
as
might
well.
as well, I suppose. Yeah, I'm going to Ohio and I'm bringing Ange, so.
Yeah, I know quite a few of the developers brought wives and partners and so on.
Yeah, that's neat. And then you all get to go out to the dinner. That's really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Do you guys talk
I
shop
felt
at dinners?
sorry, yet we do, and so I
Yeah.
felt a little sorry for
Yeah,
some of the
yeah.
wives that time.
That would be the downside for them. But,
Yeah.
I mean, they probably.
But it's not the only thing we talk about. We had lots of regular
You know what? I'm
conversations.
sure those family members are used to that too. When they're associated with those people, it's probably pretty common. But I feel like you're not even mentioning the goat yet. I mean, that's what I'm looking for.
Well,
The Adventures of Groff.
One of the other things is, as you might know, back at BSDCan, we created Groff, the BSD goat. It all started out as a joke, really, and it's turned into a whole thing. But so we have this little mascot that represents the community rather than any one specific FreeBSD project
Right,
or
yeah.
any BSD project. It's popular among OpenBSD and NetBSD and so on. And one of the things we had planned was to make sure that the goat got to every conference. So that would involve, handing it off to a couple of people, to make sure that, all right, who here is going to the next conference and make sure it got there. But the other thing is we managed to work with the organizer, and so Groff actually had his own badge for the conference. I think you have a picture of it there.
Yeah, I do.
So it even had a special color, right? Like speakers were green and attendees were another color, and organizers were red and volunteers were gray, and Groff was yellow.
I like
So
Groff had his own
badge-
yellow.
Yeah, Groff not only had his own badge, but a special category, a color for his badge. And at BSDCan, Benedict, who had been keeping Groff and making sure he went to Euro, because originally I wasn't going to be able to go, so I handed it over to Benedict to make sure it would get there. And then it was going to be passed off there to someone else to go to the next conference. Originally, that was actually going to be an OpenBSD developer to take it to Asia BSDCon, but MeetBSD, it was like, oh, we can't miss MeetBSD. So Groff was handed off to Sean Bruno, who's going to bring him to MeetBSD. And so he has the Twitter account now. So we're expecting to see lots of humorous tweets over the next month leading up to MeetBSD as well.
I see. So as the goat is handed off, so are the Twitter credentials.
Yes, and so we're expecting to see lots of interesting stories and pictures and so on. And there was lots of great pictures at the conference. Not all of them are on Twitter yet. I'm waiting for a couple of people that took them with like cameras and stuff to send them in. One of them actually was Sean Webb, who is actually the guy that accidentally started Groff, right? He's back at BSDCan, he was practicing his presentation, and he mentioned having to sacrifice a goat to make sure that his demo went well. And then that's how I got volunteered to provide the goat, so I wouldn't have to go through customs and on and on and on. And that's how Groff got started. And so he got a couple of great pictures of Groff at the dinner table and such. Because Groff even comes to dinner with us.
Of course, part of the community, and Groff even gives a talk if it's the right talk, apparently.
Yes. Groff was up on stage with a bunch of the different presenters, and Sean was actually holding Groff, and then even Andrew Tannenbaum, who had no idea what was going on, he's like, "I've never shared a stage with a flying goat before."
Hey, first time for everything, right?
Yeah. I'm going to have to remember to add a question to our interview with him of what he thought was going on with the goat. But we also have a picture here. There's a big flag for EuroBSDCon.
Yeah.
And they update it every year with the flag of the country each conference has been on, because EuroBSDCon's been going on since 2001, and it's been in a different location each year, so that people get to, that's every place I've been in Europe has been because of EuroBSDCon, or when I went to the UK, it was FreeBSD Dev Summit, but same thing. And so, I'm looking forward to the fact that next year it will be in Stockholm, Sweden.
Oh, man. Oh, that's going to be good eating, Alan.
Yep.
That's going to be good eating.
And, the other nice thing was just seeing how many people were at the conference and came up to us and said, I came because you guys told me on BSD Now how great it would be.
That's awesome.
The other great thing was just a bunch of the new people mentioned, they were really surprised with how nice and open everybody and accessible everybody was. Like one person, at one of the dinners ended up sitting across from Theo de Rat, who, most people that don't know better think he's this big scary guy, right? He's like Linus, right?
You think he's going to yell at you?
Right. Because he does yell in the emails, but that's kind of his job, is to,
knock people on the head when they need knocked around.
BSD.
Yeah.
But, he's a really nice guy to sit to and talk to, and right, and so he made sure everybody got introduced, and he's a great person to have dinner with.
You can you can also people can follow Groff directly. Groff the BSD Goat, Groff the BSD Goat on Twitter.
And we expect Sean to be posting many humorous things. Apparently, he had a bunch of ideas at the conference, and he's couldn't wait to get.
I follow Groff because I just get a little taste of how the conference is going.
Yep.
Which is just a great.
Benedict, when he was taking him, he also there's a bunch of great pictures here. He took him to work, and there's a picture of him taking a ZFS exam in German.
Sure, why not?
Him playing with some of the FreeBSD swag. I got this awesome water bottle.
Ooh.
It says proud donor on one side and keeping FreeBSD free on the other side.
That's really sick.
Insulated water bottle. And I'm always needing a water bottle. It's great. Yeah. And there's Groff reading Dilbert comics. And,
jeez.
You found this great, somebody had stuck a note on a wiring closet saying, "You shall make your assignment pledges upon the sacred devices. These hallowed routers and switches have been configured by our greatest CCIEs. They have switched frames and routed packets alike. One day you may be worthy enough to configure them. Until then, you may kneel before them." It's don't mess with our routers.
Every time we talk about it, you make me want to go. Every single time.
And so, the next one's MeetBSD in November in California.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be great. And then the dates for AsiaBSDCon were announced at EuroBSDCon. So it'll be March 12th through the 15th in Tokyo at the University of Science.
That makes me want. I'm going to Ohio. That's all I got.
Yep.
That's all I got.
Well, I was gonna get to go to Ohio, but it turns out to be too close to.
Yeah, I know. I remember.
So.
But if you're in the Ohio area or you want to go to Ohio Linux Fest, go check it out. It's at the end of October, the 24th or 20th. I can't remember.
Although while at EuroBSDCon, every year I get sucked into doing something. I was talking to a bunch of people that are organizers for FOSDEM, and they're trying to get me to come out to that, which is apparently, at EuroBSDCon, we have 3 talks going on at once, and there's 250 people at the conference. At FOSDEM, apparently they have 26 tracks at once, and 5,000 people are there.
Wow. That's going to be a big one.
Yeah, I'm that's going to be a little different. It's that, we kind of like the size of EuroBSD conference.
Yeah, there is a nice.
You don't want it too much bigger because otherwise someone could be there and you might not actually run into them.
Well, you can't all fit at the dinner table.
Exactly. There's no way that 5,000 people can all go out to dinner together.
It really does make a difference. It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, you ready to...
and there was one other thing. Chris and I talked and decided and, kind of got cajoled by people at IX to do it. We're going to do some live streaming from MeetBSD.
Right on.
Yes.
That's going to be exciting.
Possibly going to try something kind of like you guys did at Linux Fest Northwest.
Cool.
Except, so we'll have a booth set up and we'll just get all the cool BSD people as they walk by to come talk to us for a couple minutes.
Yeah, I had a sense that they might be pulling your arm about that. I had a sense. Yeah. A little birdie told me. I'm really looking forward to that. I think that's going to be Denise. Yeah, it is.
Well, because originally Chris wasn't gonna come to MeetBSD because he'd have to leave on Halloween, and he has 5 kids, and Halloween's a big deal there.
Well, how does he have time to have 5 kids, dude?
Yeah, I know.
I have 3. That's nuts.
And then one of their birthdays is he would be gone too.
Well, when you have 5, it's almost impossible for that not to happen.
Exactly. But, IX kind of twisted his arm, so he'll be there too. So
Right on. Well, that I'm looking forward to big time.
Yes. So it'll be great to see people at MeetBSD, and I hope a bunch more people make it their first conference and get to meet a bunch of cool people and realize how great a community it is. Because, I've been using BSD for basically 10 years before I went to my first conference. And immediately, I regretted not starting going to conferences 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
It is really a great experience, and
it's neat too because at least for me, I grew up in a time where there weren't a lot of people I could physically talk to that knew what the hell I was talking about.
Even now, there are not that many people around that I could hang out with and have the conversations that I end up having at these conferences.
And it's not just an equal exchange, but often they'll contribute something to the conversation that you wouldn't have been able to. get on your own. So it's really
I
valuable.
know almost everybody at the conference probably feels this way, but it's like you're surrounded by all these people that are smarter than you.
Yeah.
And you want to
Take advantage of it. Yeah.
Talk to people. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's weird because, when they're coming up to you and asking your advice or opinion
sure.
on something,
I bet that
you're
is
like,
weird, yeah.
But you're that famous expert guy. Why are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
It's
Speaking of
great
people
time.
asking us stuff, you ready to get into emails?
Yes, we better go on to
yeah.
that.
All
We'll
right.
never get out of here.
So this is one that I've kicked around for a while, so I thought I'd kick it around with you. Borin, the CCCP, writes in, and he says, I'm not sure if this is the place for it, but you know what? Borin is just fine on the subreddit. He says, have you considered enabling HTTPS on JupiterBroadcasting.com? And so, Alan, what do you think the advantage would be of a site like Jupiter Broadcasting that doesn't have any confidential, everything we want it as public as possible, but there's other reasons than privacy, right? What do you think?
Right.
Is it worth it?
The main thing about SSL is being sure that the site you're going to is actually the site you expect.
Yeah, legit.
So it means somebody can't do a man in the middle and, present you a different Jupiter Broadcasting that has bad stuff instead of videos or something. Or, to keep you from watching TechSNAP so you don't patch your shit.
Right.
But I guess the one point somebody brought up was that Google's starting to consider SSL in its ranking thing. And, it's not a very strong indicator yet, but it might become one over time. So I wouldn't say it's a high priority for Jupiter Broadcasting.
What about performance? Any concern there?
There's a slight speed loss. The handshake means an extra round trip to set it up, although the CDN mitigates that somewhat. And then it does pose a couple of complications. We offload a lot of the images to a subdomain.
Yeah, right.
It's actually not on JupiterBroadcasting.com, so that would need a different SSL certificate.
And isn't that also ranked by Google as a good thing?
Yes. And so there's a couple of different things, but the biggest one really is that currently SSL requires an IP address for every different domain name. And there are only so many IP addresses left, and that poses an issue. And, they cost money. Now, there is a system called SNI, or Server Name Indication, that can solve that. The problem is that even though it came out years ago, before XP Service Pack 2, Microsoft decided not to include support for it in Service Pack 2 to try to force users to upgrade to Vista or something. Who
That's
knows why
ridiculously twisted.
But it means that Windows XP users can't do it. So if they go to a website that's the second website on the same IP address with SSL, they'll get an error saying, hey, this isn't the first website. Whereas everybody else will get it just fine. Also, older Android devices like 2. Whatever, or the ones that never get updated anymore, they don't support it either. And there's a whole list of other devices that don't support it. And so, does Jupiter Broadcasting want it? If they don't have a dedicated IP address for the domain name, then they cut off everybody using XP from accessing the site over SSL.
Okay. So that's something for people to be aware of if they're considering this.
And especially with the CDN, you could end up... We actually use a bunch of different subdomains and so on.
Sure.
So not only would we need an IP address for Jupiter Broadcasting, but the CDN would have to have a dedicated IP address on each different server for the subdomains.
That seems like it'd be a big problem for a lot of places.
Right. Now, if you're doing Anycast, you could have the same IP address on every server, and it would be less complicated. But even though you would still need one per customer, and if you have thousands of customers, that's a lot of IP addresses.
It sure is.
And so that's why, Microsoft is preventing us from having SSL everywhere.
Well, it's just like a lot of things. You got to wait for the
XP is dead.
Yeah, you got to wait for it to
older
trail
Android
off.
is dead, and all this other stuff is dead. Even though we've had SNI for like 10 years, we still can't use it because of old stuff.
Thankfully, we have I don't think it'll be long until our XP numbers are in the single digits.
Well, and it's also, we talked about it the other week, switching to using like SHA-2 hashing on SSL certificates. Can't happen until those same devices go away.
Right.
And, that's... luckily for that one, they're working on a fix where we can present the new certificate to anybody that supports it and the old one to people that don't. But that doesn't really work for SSL, for the actually doing SSL on the site. So basically, we could try to make it an optional feature, but really cause a lot of complications, and plus there's actually a cost, right? Jupiter Broadcasting would have to buy a certificate.
There's that, I suppose, too. All right. Well, it's just kind of a general discussion. It's good little points to consider.
So it'd be fairly easy to do it for the website. The problem is the CDN. It gets complicated. Specifically, we're not wanting to break it for everybody that uses Windows XP still. Although maybe we do want to break Jupiter Broadcasting for anybody that uses XP. It's hard to say.
All right, Jack writes in. He needs some help with the command line. He says, I've begun moving away from Google in favor of OwnCloud on a DigitalOcean droplet. Been running CM11 without any Google apps on my Nexus 5 for about a month. I bet, Jack, your battery life has been incredibly better, and I know mine has. Using F-Droid as my go-to for the replacement to the Google Play Store, it works quite well for me, and I don't see myself needing to go back to all the Google apps again. But here's my question. I've created a cron job to put most of my important folders into an archive and upload it to Google Drive, ironically, with the help of a tool called Google CL, which is the command line interface. He does this on a regular basis, but here's the catch. He'd like to have those archives encrypted. Can you recommend some sort of software and maybe talk a little about what algorithms are preferred or considered good enough? Love the show. It's one of my weekly highlights, Jack. So he wants a command line encryption tool, and what do you recommend?
Well, it depends what kind of encryption he wants to do, but obviously PGP can work. So what that'll do is you'll have a private key that you keep to yourself and a public key you can do whatever with. And you would take that file and encrypt it with the public key so that only the private key could decrypt it, right? So now doing it with keys is slow. So what you end up doing actually is coming up with a random password, like what GPG does internally, is come up with a random password, encrypt that with the key and store it in the archive, and then encrypt the whole file with the password. So then when you receive it, you can decrypt the password and then decrypt the file. It's kind of a two-step thing, but it allows you to combine the extra security of the fact that your PGP key will be like 2048 or 4096 bit, and then that'll be too slow to encrypt a large file. Well, not necessarily too slow. You might want to do, but anyway, then you would just do regular like AES 256 encryption on the actual file. But the password would be big, long, random thing that would then be encrypted with the bigger key. Anyway, or there's OpenSSL, right? You can just say OpenSSL and you can encrypt with AES 256 directly with a password, and then you just need to run OpenSSL decrypt on the file with the same password, and you'll get your file back. There are lots of other options, but those are the two easiest ones, and one or both of them probably are already installed on all your systems.
I like that too. That's nice, especially when it's your own data and you never know what your situation is going to be when you need to recover it.
But really, if you're backing stuff up and like that, and especially command line, you might want to look at TarSNAP.
Yeah, don't use Google Drive.
Yeah,
I mean, I know
the advantage
cheap,
is
large
Google Drive is free.
Well, even once you add, like, you can get a ton of storage for super cheap.
Right.
So,
although TarSNAP's really not expensive, but
yeah.
So you can use OpenSSL or PGP or whatever, depending on how you want to do it and how worried you are about how long it's going to take to encrypt and decrypt and so on. But as far as crypto algorithm, something like I would imagine AES 256, probably CBC or whatever, it will do the best for encrypting individual files. Most times it'll just default to something. You might want to change it, but I don't have specific advice on that. You would have to ask a cryptographer. It was nice being in the same room as a bunch of them and asking them a bunch of questions.
Yeah, just, hey, I've been wondering.
Having two of them standing beside each other and ask one of them a question, and then the other one's like, oh, so, Colin's like, we don't use the AES GCM because of a certain side channel or whatever. And then John Mark's like, well, I want to talk to you about that for half an hour. I want to understand why you decide not to do that so I can, augment my own opinion about it.
Oh, that is cool. All right, so Tony writes in. And he's got a question that has probably crossed a lot of our viewers' minds. He says, hey, Chris and Alan, of course, cough, cough, mentioned shout-outs to Angela and Matt and the rest of the amazing JB crew. He says, greetings from the cradle country of the Linux kernel. He wants to know, how safe are VLANs in reality? Can I route both my internet and LAN through the same managed switch? In this case, it's an HP 18010 V2 with 8 gigabit ports. If I create the following VLANs, ID1 is a private LAN untagged ports 1 through 5 and exclude ports 6 and 8. ID 100 is my bridged ISP connection, and he excludes ports 1 through 5 and untags ports 6 through 8. Is there still a way someone from the internet could access my private LAN, or is this a viable and secure solution for network separation? I could, of course, just buy 2 separate switches, but I prefer using one, and of course, it would save some money too.
Yep. That looks right. Now, if you want one machine to be able to access both, that's when the tagging would come in, and you'd have to configure the box. So the tag and untag is interesting. So basically, what it means is, when the packet leaves the port on the switch, it will remove the VLAN tag that's on the packet, basically putting it back into VLAN 0. And that the difference is that basically when your NIC is just connected and configured with an IP address, it only accepts packets that are destined for VLAN 0. And then you, with software or whatever, you would configure it, to also be in other VLANs. So by using the untag configuration, you just make your boxes dumb and they don't have to know anything about it. So yes, the way he set it up here, ports 1 through 5 will be able to talk to each other, but they won't be able to talk to ports 6 through 8. And then his other one would be the opposite. And that way, the packets can't ever go between any of the 2 ports.
And the level that
I'm
is
guessing his router is connected to both one port in each of the 2 VLANs, and that means that it would be possible for someone to go through if they were to somehow take over the router.
Right. That is a great question.
Or if there's a rule on the router that actually passes them back and forth.
That is a great question.
Basically, the router is the gateway between the 2.
Yeah.
Because obviously the machines on the LAN have to somehow get to the internet, and that'll be through the router. But in general, yes, if your router's, it's a firewall, and so it's going to decide what goes through.
So his core question is really, can there be leakage between the 2 VLANs? And that VLAN tagging is happening at the Ethernet packet level, right? It's above what the operating systems really have say over. You can manipulate it at the operating system level and set the tag, but if you're not plugged in the right spot from the switch perspective, it doesn't matter.
The switch is going to enforce it. So if there's a bug in the switch, it might be possible for leakage, but in general, no, packets won't get between the 2, and it'll be as if you had 2 physically separated switches. Yeah. Of course, like you said, there's the one machine that's in both VLANs that can pass packets.
Yeah.
Although you can actually, by using the tagging, have, for example, the one port on your router be in both VLANs at the same time, and packets from both will go down the one Ethernet cable and then be separated into 2 virtual interfaces on the router so that you can do stuff with them.
Yeah.
Actually, my machine at my desk here is actually like that. So at my house, I have 2 VLANs, one that's for the office in the basement, and then one that's for the stuff in the house, like my TV and my laptop and so on. But my main machine that I do most of my work on is actually in both VLANs. Now, it has routing disabled, so it won't pass packets between the 2. But, if somebody wanted to somehow get from the office or from the home network into the office network, one of the 2 vectors would be my computer and the other one would be the router.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I suppose if the switch had some sort of flaw or vulnerability...
Although this is pretty low level, and hopefully that wouldn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. I don't worry about it much. And and you think about the massive, large enterprise production environments where they're doing this very thing. It's used on such a major scale that...
but basically, the math and the code for it is so simple that it'd be pretty hard to screw it up.
Next email comes in, it's actually a Reddit post, comes in from Mazapan. He says, hey guys, he's got a weird wildcard mailbox problem he wants help with. He says, I've got a domain hosted on Google Apps with a wildcard mailbox attached to my account. The problem is that my inbox gets full every day, not with spam, but replies to spam. The spam is seemingly sent from my domain name, but from accounts which do not exist. Latest example today is 25 pounds off lisa.willies2e@domain.com. As I remember, I have taken all DNS security steps that Google asks you to do, but the problem seems not to be on my end anyways. I'm afraid my domain might get blacklisted. I imagine this is more widespread. What is it I can do? So, Alan, what do you think is going on? What can he do?
Well, this is what the spam he's getting is what's called backscatter. So basically, somebody is sending spam and claiming it's from his domain. Now, if he has, Center Policy Framework or SPF records and a bunch of other stuff like you talked about, the DNS security steps, then most places should refuse the mail, but some places are configured poorly.
I'm thinking he didn't set up SPF.
But even if he did, honestly, what he's getting is usually the error message saying, hey, we refused this email because it was forked.
Yeah, right.
there are places that started blacklisting people for sending the backscatter, because they're basically contributing to the spam problem. So now most places will actually silently delete email like that, which, while reducing the spam problem, does have the side effect of people not knowing possibly that their email didn't get through. So yeah, it's really a complicated problem. But often what the spam bots will do is they will try to send an email to, like they'll try to construct email addresses by doing like first name dot last name or just plain first names at a domain.com. And when they try to send an email and they don't get an error saying that that account doesn't exist, they assume it's a real account. So if you have a catch-all, you can end up with all these seemingly real-looking addresses on your domain that people are that the spammers are sending spam to or from. You know, I have a wildcard domain as well, and yeah, I get weird ones like misspellings of people's names and stuff that are getting spam or bounces or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There's not that much you can do. Is most times it's not going to get your domain blacklisted because this happens all the time to everybody. So, you know, if they blacklisted everybody, that wouldn't work.
Okay.
But yeah, you want to look at SPF, which basically is a way in DNS of saying, these are the IP addresses that will ever send mail legitimately from my domain.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get email from somebody else, it wasn't from me, it was spam, don't accept it.
Right. Might help.
And it has a system, so like if you're using Google Apps for your domain, you can say, you know, include the records from Google so that Google can update their records without you having to update yours. You say, just pull in all the records from Google over here, plus here's the IP address of my website, since my website might send email from my domain, you know, as a, you know, people fill out a form and you want to send them an email or something. So you have to think of all the places that would ever send an email from your domain legitimately and have them on a list, basically. And then anything not on that list. Now, with SPF, you can specify whether it should be, you know, if it's wide open or if it should be a soft fail, meaning might be spam, but I'm not 100% sure that I listed everything correctly. Or you can say a hard fail saying, you know, anything that's not on this list is definitely spam.
Yeah, I feel his
but
pain.
other than that, you're just going to get a lot of spam.
Yeah, that's like if he's done some of the things you've suggested, then he might be SOL, Alan.
Yeah. Like at Scale Engine, we even resorted to actually domain keys signing every outbound email. And so if it doesn't have a signature on it, it's not from us.
All right, Jay writes in. Now, the audience, we got a few emails on Shellshock. I grabbed a couple things. Jay writes in. He says, "Hey, Alan and Chris, thanks for the great show. I have a number of servers that I use as personal servers, and SSH is the only internet-facing port. I have a question about Bash, Shellshock, and SSH. I do not understand how this issue is a problem with SSH. The only vector I see is if the user can log in. Number one, can Bash Shellshock affect SSH during a connection phase before login? And number two, are there any other vectors of attack that maybe I'm missing? Thanks, Jay."
Well, yeah, basically, if SSH is the only thing, it's probably not so bad. But, you know, like we said, a mail server could trigger it accidentally. So if you have a forwarding rule or anything, basically, if anything uses Bash and the user can provide the input that Bash looks at, it can be a problem.
So probably, with SSH, like the versions of SSH where the scenarios in SSH where I've heard this problem is like if there's a pre and post script that gets executed.
Yeah,
right.
And a couple other things, but in general, with SSH, not a big deal. But no matter what, update your Bash so it's not vulnerable. Problem solved.
Yeah, really. You see, you know, I know you have a lot of servers, but yeah. All right. Now,
like all mine are updated already.
Here's the meta debate. If
you have a lot of servers, you should have a system in place for updating them quickly because you're going to need it one day, and you'll be glad you did the work when, you know, the world wasn't on fire.
No kidding. Okay, Alan. Tom asks what we've all been thinking. He says, "Hello, everyone. Thanks for the awesome show. I have a debatable question. Is open source really open? Number one, this Shellshock is just another example that open source really isn't all that open. Many experts are using Bash, but they haven't ever seen the bug. In fact, there's been many years, and they haven't seen this bug. All those security officers, all those advocates who are praising open source, one of the arguments is you can check the code and make sure that it's okay. And point number two, and now that it's been discovered, now what? Update? What will be updated? All devices that run open source that are vulnerable? Really? Probably not. So, in what extent is open source better than closed source software?" Tom.
Well, if Bash was closed source, it wouldn't be used in so many places, really. But Well, yes, anybody can look at the source. That only does any good if people actually do, right? And that's why we have things like bug bounties, right?
I would
That's why
agree.
Google
Yeah.
started the one for OpenSSH and OpenSSL, saying, "Hey, find a bug here, send it in." Like, actually, I was saw a conversation happening at EuroBSDCon where someone had submitted, I think it was a bug in OpenSSH or OpenSSL, one of the two, and got a $2,000 bug bounty from Google and donated and had Google donate it directly to the FreeBSD Foundation.
That's cool.
Or actually, I think it was the bug bounty was $1,000, but Google says if you donate your bug bounty,
bounty.
to an open source foundation, they'll double it.
Gosh, that's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's neat.
they donated it to
that's an incentive
the FreeBSD
program.
Foundation.
That's kind of
in
new,
the
though.
name of the security research.
The incentives haven't necessarily been there, and I think
Right,
Tom.
and Google only covers like 4 projects currently.
So-
Bash not being one of them.
I got 3 points I want to touch on. Number one is what you said. Is it's particularly hard to one-to-one measure them because the scale of deployment of open source code of things like OpenSSL and Bash is made possible because they are open source. Hence, it's not necessarily fair to compare them to a closed source alternative because a closed source alternative would never have seen the market penetration that technology did. So that's point number one. But I think the point number two that is extremely important, and Tom, I think maybe is kind of confusing, is I grant you open source needs to be better about catching the stuff up front. All eyes on the code should make the problems more shallow. And now we are seeing incentive programs, some that are really just now sort of being established in the wake of Heartbleed that are being created around that. But here's point number 3. What you really have to watch at, and you really have to consider, is that software vulnerabilities will always exist as long as it is human beings that are writing the code. Once the robots take over and they write the code, I think it's legitimate to have a higher set of standards. But until then, we almost kind of have to accept that this is the reality we are going to have to face for a long time, regardless of the license, right? The license doesn't make the human being write better software.
Really, the problem here isn't open source or closed source. It's the fact that we build devices without considering how to update them.
Yeah. And
Every device should be ready to receive updates because it's going to happen.
Yeah, you can look at the post-Shellshock situation as in 2 different ways. One, bit of a clown show. Several updates, everybody dog piles on, everybody freaks out. That's one way to look at it. Second way to look at it is, holy crap, once the vulnerability was found, because the entire world was able to crowdsource the problem and everybody was looking at the code at once all of a sudden, once we knew about it, everyone looked. And then we really saw tons and tons of not just fixes, but like, here's how to test it, here's how to check yourself, here's how to immediately patch it, here's how to replace the bot. Like, it blew up. And what is when you have to defend an infrastructure against attack, that latter part, that's the more important part, because once you have to respond, and you will always have to respond regardless of the license of the software, once you have to respond, the solutions that come down from the open source community are not just faster, but you have to understand that a lot of times in the commercial communities, sometimes the vulnerabilities are known for months ahead of time before anybody ever says anything, let alone code ever shipped. Right? And so in the open source scenario, that code was shipping on an hourly basis. Now, immediately, in the short term, it looks a little chaotic, but in the long term, the response window is so much tighter with open source that once something is discovered, you are much better off if it's an open source project that's being patched, because you're going to get that patch a lot faster.
Well, yeah, if Bash had been closed source and some company made it, are they still in business to even bother making? Do they care about the product
20 years
still?
later,
Like, yeah. Do they still care about the product? They're like, oh, we have this newer one you can buy. You should stop using the old one. Just get rid of it, and stuff like that. But also, yeah, they wouldn't have. They could have been like, all right, we'll have a patch for you next month.
The other thing too is we'll be curious to watch what happens is with some of these projects now. Do the eyes stay there? Right? Do people continue watching it?
If it's a closed source project, the company would have fixed the bug, and they're like, oh,
that's it.
An audit of that old code? No.
Where's the revenue in that?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it is disappointing to see. And I think part of it comes from like this mantra of open source is more secure and better and blah, 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 that has sort of been a marketing pitch that fanboys have used. But the reality is everything's flawed.
Yeah. And the difference is that it's easier for people to find them in open source, which is good and bad.
It doesn't mean we find them right away, right?
Yeah. People find the flaws and maybe they do bad things with them, but it gets fixed sooner rather than later, which is a win.
And think about from like a Rackspace or an Amazon standpoint. So if a flaw is found in Windows Server 2008, they have the security bulletin provided to them by Microsoft, and they can assess that pretty single-handedly and say, okay, this is what we suspect its impact is. When the Shellshock vulnerability is found, the engineers at Amazon can literally open up the source code and say, this is exactly how it affects us. Now, that, for me, I am never going to do that. But if I own EC2, you're damn right I want to be able to do that.
Yeah, like with the Heartbleed one, I think it was Akamai had their own patch that they had been working on. Right, it was keeping the keys separate or something.
Yeah.
Now their patch turned out to not actually solve the problem 100%.
Right.
But it's the fact that people can do stuff.
Or
like
look at like what Google did with boring SSL, where they're like, okay, we know this needs to be fixed, but in the meantime, we're going to take this, we're going to fork it, so it continues to meet our needs, which is not even an option with something that's commercial.
Like I guess their point with boring SSL is, with OpenSSL, we keep seeing these new features being added, and sometimes those new features are buggy. Well, we'd like to have a version that just only had the bare minimum stuff, so there's less surface area that could be vulnerable.
And initially, that looks like chaotic forking and fragmentation. But in the big grand scheme, when you zoom out, what that does is that allows Google to sort of buy time while things sort of iron out, and then they can choose whichever direction they want to go.
Yeah, well, it also solves the problem of part of the reason we were in that situation with Heartbleed is because it's a monoculture, right? Basically, OpenSSL was almost the only solution. There's a couple other, but they're very small. And trying to get away from that will be a big win. Like they talked about that a bit at the LibreSSL talk at EuroBSDCon. Ted Unangst gave a talk, and on top of that stuff, they also talked about ReSSL, which is their it's the replacement API. Instead of having to normally the way with SSL, you have to make this connection, and then you have to compare the certificate and stuff. And a lot of people don't bother, right? They don't know that they have to do that, or they don't bother writing the code. Or I think they found in Python there's an option there, but if you don't explicitly call it, it doesn't happen. And so well, let's build one in where you just pass in the host name as part of the call to make the connection, and it'll return an error if it doesn't match. And, then that brought up the question, well, would you do certificate pinning where you don't care about the host name? It's only the fingerprint that matters. And so they're like, oh, we'll have to reconsider that and change this around. And, it was a good discussion. And it's like, yes. It was like, while, that was actually kind of the sad thing about Heartbleed is that I know Dag Erling was working on kind of his own replacement for OpenSSL. And then I think Ted Unangst was thinking about doing something completely different. But then because Heartbleed happened, is like, well, we can't wait 2 years for me to write something from scratch. We have to take what's there and fix it instead.
It's a great question, Tom, and I bet a lot of people have been considering it in the wake of some, the Xen vulnerability, the Heartbleed vulnerability, the NSS vulnerability, and now Shellshock.
Well, and then because we always have Xen is kind of this hybrid, right? It's a big company. But it is kind of open source too.
Yeah.
But I guess the example for that maybe is Xen's open source. They have a patch for their problem right now. VMware is closed source, and people are still waiting for the bash fix from VMware.
Right.
Or not even a fair example, but
or even it's not totally fair either. But like the Apple one, Apple took much longer to get the update out. It's not a big. It's not like that. Though in those scenarios, there's even getting them out in a couple of weeks is pretty good response time. But I think what's pretty damn impressive is if you were somebody who was really on top of the situation, like Akamai was, or something like that. It's just the commercial. It's a totally different category. The commercial solution there is not even an option because of what they need to do. It's just not even a possibility. But you know what? You can send in a question like Tom did or any of our emailers. We love getting your feedback here at the TechSNAP program. Give us something to chew on or anything you need us to work through for you, assist you with or help. Anything. Systems, network, administration. You know what? We covered all. Firewalls, file systems, you name it. Wow. Not even a ZFS or a PFSense question today. Holy smokes. But here's how you do it. Go to jupiterbroadcasting.com.
We'll have a bunch more of those next week.
Yeah, I know, right? Go click on the contact link, choose TechSNAP from the drop-down, and help right that wrong. Also, links.techsnap.tv is the subreddit where not only you can get in front of us, but you also get in front of the community, and they can probably provide some answers, too. Again, jupiterbroadcasting.com/contact. Choose TechSNAP or techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com. But, Alan.
It reminds me. Stay tuned for BSD Now. In the next couple of weeks, we have the interview with the guy that originally ported ZFS to FreeBSD and has the epic story of how he did that and how,
Dang.
How programming actually happens.
In a couple of weeks? Few weeks?
It'll be, I'm not sure exactly when, but it'll be within the next couple of weeks. I didn't really mention it, but at EuroBSDCon, we recorded 9 interviews.
That's crazy, Alan. That's a haul right there.
Quite an array of different people, and it'll be great to watch them all.
So, of course, we'll mention that in the show, too. All right, Alan, with the feedback all done, that means it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. Welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the roundup of stories that just didn't quite fit at the top of the show, but heck, we want to give you some links to follow up on your own, and some of these links came from our awesome subreddit over at techsnap.reddit.com or links.techsnap.tv. And so Alan, there's this crazy amount of protests going on in Hong Kong right now, and of course, there is a IT angle to them. So at first there was a story about Android phones being hacked in the protest audience, and now we have a story about jailbroken iPhones getting hacked with a virus? A Trojan? Yep. Maybe a Trojan that's targeting iOS. It's a Chinese Trojan just targeting jailbroken iPhone users in Hong Kong, which is similar to the previous Android spyware app that we've talked about. It's a simultaneous cross-platform attack on iOS and Android users being carried out, which is suspected by Chinese potential state authorities. And here's an interesting bit about it. Going down right here, the information that it pulls on the users and it's spreading in the crowd is the address book, the SMS messages, the call logs, the location data based on cell tower ID, pictures, miscellaneous OS data, whatever that is, maybe crash logs and stuff, and a Tencent archive, which is, I guess, TechNet or Tencent. It is a Chinese messaging app that's kind of like WhatsApp. Also, passwords for authentication info, iOS keychains used by
most likely
like
they're
Apple
trying
ID.
to identify the people that are leading the protest, possibly so they can kill them.
Maybe.
And it gets pretty serious when you start looking at that.
Yeah.
Did they mention how it actually gets on your phone in the first place?
No, they not really. So the example they have in here is you install it from the Cydia store, the jailbroken app store, and which is funny because those are .deb files, which is kind of amazing. But it only affects the jailbroken phone, so I think it can spread. I think it's using a vulnerability to spread because you jailbreak by taking advantage of a vulnerability.
Or you just pretend to be the protest organizing app or whatever, and a bunch of people will install it and take it to the protest.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it, so I just put it in the roundup and we can follow it to see if anything more develops from it. But now we got it on the radar. Hey, Alan, are you going to tell us a little about the science of network troubleshooting, or at least packetlife.net is?
Yeah, they have a great kind of tutorial to just tell you about the right way to think about it.
Oh, very handy.
So there's basically 5 steps in solving a network problem. First, you have to identify the effects. What isn't working, or what is the problem, right? Then you eliminate suspected causes, and you keep doing that until you find the one that's the right one. Then once you identify what the cause is, then you can devise a solution, test it, and repeat, and so on.
That's always stop right there.
Mitigate against it from happening again.
One of my favorites is always like, well, how are you going to fix it? Well, I don't know how I'm going to fix it. I don't know what the problem is yet. I can't tell you what the fix is until I identify the problem. Yeah, no kidding. That's great.
I remember just a general troubleshooting cases. I remember, our math teacher was having a problem with her computer wouldn't turn on or whatever, and one of my friends is like, "Oh, your motherboard might have got fried. You try this. You have to buy a new one." Blah blah. I'm like, make sure the power cord is plugged all the way in, and there's a little switch by the power cord, and make sure that one's on.
Oh, geez.
And it turns out that's what the problem was.
Mm-hmm.
Or I've seen people trying all this stuff. It's like, I can't get the internet. What's going on? It's like, well, you don't have an IP address. Why don't you have an IP address? Oh, because you're not plugged into the network or whatever, right? So it kind of, so the first thing is identify the effects. So what was working and has stopped working? What wasn't working and has started working? What continued to work when other things stopped working? And, when did it change? Then does that correlate with something else that happened at the same time? Who is affected and who wasn't? Oh, so it's only affecting that computer, but not this computer. And they're on the same switch, so it's not, from the switch to the rest of the network is obviously fine. It's got to be something between the switch and the one computer that's not working or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is the condition intermittent or does it happen all the time? Like, is it always broken or is it come and go? Is it come and go at predictable intervals?
Right.
I think one of the greatest war stories I ever heard was there was this company that had this printer switch where you could switch, one computer but could print to different printers.
Oh, those old classic like clunker switches? Okay, yeah.
Well, this one was digital. It wasn't clunker.
Oh, okay.
And then they couldn't figure it out. But every morning when they came back in, it had been reset and was printing to the wrong printer, the first printer instead of like the third printer.
Okay.
And they tried and they couldn't figure it out. So they hired an outside consultant to come in and try to figure it out. And eventually he figured out what the problem was.
So this outside expert came in and analyzed the situation.
Finally figured out the problem.
Okay, yeah.
The cleaning lady was unplugging it to plug in the vacuum cleaner.
Yep. How did I
And
know?
plugging it back in, and so it would reset. And they're looking for like some, super complicated software problem. But no, the problem was somebody was unplugging the device and resetting it every
No
day.
joke, Alan. No joke. This is way back in the day. We had a NetWare Novell server, and it was NetWare 3 something. They were rock solid, never went down except for this one. And we started to suspect it was because I custom built it, and maybe there was a hardware failure, and so it would reboot every night, and we didn't know exactly what was causing it. Same story. Cleaning lady was coming into the server room, which this is so long ago they didn't even bother locking the server room, and coming in there, unplugging that server from the UPS, Alan.
She was plugging her vacuum cleaner into the UPS.
And these were really huge UPSs, so it just looked like a wall of
little
plugs.
one. I'm like, it would flip out if you plugged a
No,
vacuum
it was a
cleaner
big
into
one.
it.
It's just a big wall of plugs. She didn't know it was a UPS, but she was plugging the vacuum into a UPS and unplugging the server. Legitimate. This happened in the place I worked at, so I totally believe that story.
Yeah.
It happens.
Well, obviously your problem there was that your UPS was maxed out. You didn't have any more ports for her to use for the vacuum cleaner.
The problem was we weren't locking the data center.
Yes.
That was the problem. And then the question was like, do we really need the data center vacuumed every night? No, we don't.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So then step 2 is eliminate suspect causes.
Okay.
Right? The popular mantra is always start with layer 1. Is the network card physically plugged in? Right?
Right.
And that should be verified before going higher. Right? And then, so all right, Ethernet. You have do you have a carrier? That one, yeah, even Windows will say the network cable's unplugged. Right? So if the cable is plugged in, but it still says network cable's unplugged, you obviously need to check the other end of the cable.
Very true.
Maybe if the switch is powered off, then it'll show up as network cable unplugged, even though the cable's plugged in fine on your end. Right? So that's layer 2. Layer 3, do you have an IP address? If you don't, then obviously either your static allocation is messed up or you're not getting a DHCP address from something. Then once you have an IP address, can you ping your default gateway? Right? Can you get to the router, which is in your same subnet? So only going through a switch and not having to go through any routers. It's the first router. Can you get to that? If you can, then, does your DNS work? And then you go on and on until you, find out where the problem is. But you have to always start at the bottom because that's where, you can't tell if your internet connection is working or not if your network cable isn't plugged in. Then define a working condition. So what is actually enough to say that it's working, right?
Very true.
Because, it could be, can I connect to the website? But it could also be, can I connect to the website and not have 10% packet loss or whatever, right? Then define a test for the condition. So if the internet works means I can get to Google, then how do I test that I can get to Google? That was a funny one. At one point, Google experimented with blocking pings.
Yes.
Because they literally get so many pings, it's costing them piles and piles of money.
Right. But it's useful.
Then everybody's scripts just stopped working. Like, everybody's Nagios went crazy. It's like, the whole internet is down. I can't get to Google.
Yeah.
Because everybody was like, all right, as a sanity check, don't report an outage if Google isn't up either, because it means the Nagios is just not reaching the internet or whatever, right? And so on. Then, apply that test and record the results and then move on. And that way, you can end up with a checklist that you can go through and like, all right, something's not working. Does this work? Yes, this, until you find the thing that's not working. Then you have to devise a solution, which is define what failed. The internet is down turns into users in building 10 cannot access the internet because their subnet was removed from the outbound ACL on the firewall. Right? And then you define the proposed solution is like, put it back on the ACL. You don't want your blanket solution to be something like reboot the device because obviously something else is wrong, right? And rebuilding the configuration of the router or the firewall from scratch might fix the problem, but that's a giant waste of time. It doesn't actually help you find out what went wrong. Right? All right, user in building 10 can't reach the internet. Let's rewrite the ACL. No, let's find out why the ACL isn't working, right? and then apply the solution and record the results so that in the future, if someone has this problem again, they'll know where to look. Right? You want to maintain focus. Don't get distracted by some other problem until you've solved this one, right?
Right.
Upon being frustrated with a failure or failures, opt to, just recklessly reboot, reconfigure, or replace a device instead of actually figuring out what's going on, because then you don't know what to do next time. That's the one we always brought up, is the difference between a Unix admin and a Windows admin. Is the Windows admin starts by rebooting, and the Unix admin, it's only as a last resort kind of thing. And the difference is that whether or not you find out what actually caused the problem. Also, watch out for hazardous changes. When developing a solution, remember to evaluate what effects might happen when you make a change, because nothing is worse than making a change and then realizing that now I broke the internet for the entire building, not just the one person that was having a problem.
Yes.
Nothing's more horrible than the feeling of realizing you fixed one problem at the expense of causing a much larger problem. Then you want to test and repeat and then mitigate so the problem can't happen again. Very good checklist to go.
Very good checklist, yeah. All right, this is a story that I just don't even know how to wrap my head around. Have you heard about how Russia is requiring certain sites to register as information gatherers, and then they have to store the customers? If they register as an information gatherer, they are then required to store Russian customers' information in Russia. That part doesn't sound too unreasonable, but the practical implication, as you would probably imagine, is certain sites just thrown in the bag. One of them, who knows how long this is going on, but one of them right now that has been blacklisted in Russia as a result of this is GitHub. As of today, GitHub is, at least momentarily, blacklisted in Russia. And it is because
GitHub doesn't really collect that much information about the user. Like, they don't even require a real name.
Yeah. And you know what? Actually, as of 20 minutes ago, it was already removed from the blacklist. Well, boom! How about that? So this is an interesting problem because they've been reaching out to a lot of different companies saying, "Hey, are you an information gatherer? You need to come register here."
Now, Russia has their own reasons why they're doing this, but in general, you could see how, Canada would say you can only store information about Canadian customers in Canada so that the U.S. can't just subpoena it or take it or whatever.
Yeah, I know. That's what sucks.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. All right, Alan R.
It kind of fits in with that Microsoft storing data in Ireland and the U.S. government trying to get it. And so
you followed my train of thought precisely. You have a post here.
I have a nice one here. Yeah. So there's a website called thesecuritysetup.com, and they're profiling a bunch of different security researchers and what their computer setup looks like.
It's such a great topic.
Yeah. So, the one of the original posts was, some guys is like, I just have a 2012 MacBook Pro and that's what I use or whatever. But the most recent one is H.D. Moore, who is Chief Research Officer at Rapid7, the guys that make Metasploit. And he also runs Project Sonar, where they're, remember, he did the research on that, what's the protocol called for port forwarding? Plug and play, UPnP.
UPnP.
And a bunch of other things like that. And so he talks about his setup. And he says, since 1995, he's a big diehard Linux user, but in 2009, he switched to Windows. He basically found that, running Windows and then putting everything in VMs on top of that worked better than trying to run Linux and running Windows in a VM on top of that. Because of corporate stuff, he has to run like Outlook and PowerPoint and so on, and it's easier to do that on the host than to do that in the virtual box or whatever, and just put the Linux in the virtual box since, with X11 and SSH, it's easy to access the stuff. So it's not so much that he prefers Windows as it's actually just easier to do it that way. But also it lets him, as far as, editing an Office document in your email and getting it done, it's just easier to, it's the same reason why, even though in my day job I'm sitting here running 100 FreeBSD servers, my desktop runs Windows. And the same reason why most of the FreeBSD and Linux developers run a Mac, because it just works, it lets them do their email and stuff, and then they can do the development and get it out of the way. But at the same time, if you're not dogfooding, if you're a FreeBSD developer and you're not running FreeBSD on your desktop, then you're not annoyed by all these bugs and you don't fix them.
There's a problem with that,
too. Or you don't notice the other problems, too,
yes,
right?
There's very much an issue.
Yeah. But anyway, so he talks about his setup and, that he uses Chrome for his web browser. He has VMware for running to do AMD 64 virtual machines, and uses QEMU to do RISC stuff like ARM. Since he's obviously playing with the firmware and stuff from a lot of embedded devices, he uses that as well.
Cool.
And he uses SSH forwarded to an XFCE tabbed terminal environment. His laptop is an Asus ROG G750 with 17-inch display, and goes on about that. And says that his laptops cost about $1,500. He also likes to play Borderlands and Skyrim on maximum settings.
Borderlands is badass. So is Sublime Text. He's a Sublime Text 3 fan, and so am I. I like that one a lot. He also likes Goat Simulator, Alan. He's got to give a call out to Goat Simulator.
Yeah. He's got a non-portable, like a desktop, which is a Frankenstein machine. He took some HP workstations and gutted them and replaced components and, just kind of built a Frankenstein machine.
Sounds like mine upstairs. I have a Frankenstein upstairs.
His primary desktop is an HP Z420 with a single Xeon E5 1620 that's water-cooled, 64 gigs of RAM, two 256 gig SSDs in RAID 0 as his boot device, and a 4 terabyte backup drive. And he's got 3 24-inch IPS displays in a vertical plus horizontal plus vertical configuration, which matches his typical workflow of an open web browser, a productivity screen with his terminals and documents, and another screen dedicated to email and IRC stacked vertically. And he goes on and talks about that. And sadly, his data storage is on a Synology instead of a FreeNAS.
Can't judge too much.
I'll have to talk to him about that.
All right.
And he goes on to talk about there's lots of detail in here. Oh, apparently his router is Ubuntu on an Intel NUC, a V2 with running an i5 with a plain old SSD.
Wonder what he's doing for the second
Should
NIC.
be using pfSense for that.
I wonder what he's using for the second NIC. I wonder if he's going USB.
The router is connected to a trunk port on his main switch, which VLAN tags traffic for each port, including his 2 internet links, because he has 2 internet links. The primary link is a 1 gigabit by 1 gigabit from AT&T that falls back to a 10 meg by 1 meg cable link whenever a butterfly flaps its wings in China and AT&T dies. Once Google finishes their Austin rollout of fiber, he plans to move to dual gigabit and some fancy routing policies to load balance across his 2 gigabit connections. So it looks like he just uses the 1 NIC and then does VLANs, since he's not going to be doing a whole gigabit usually. So that's how he does it there. Mm-hmm. And then he talks about how he deals with SCADA and ICS stuff, debugging toys. He has a plastic bin of crap, and so on, and goes on to talk more about his software, how he likes, having the Unix tools like sort, egrep, word count, xargs, etc., and plays a lot of stuff. And yeah, like you mentioned, Goat Simulator. He says, yes, it's a real thing. Imagine Tony Hawk as an invincible goat without a skateboard. Played by a drunk 5-year-old. That's what he says he pines for a dual OS environment.
Oh, really?
That doesn't require compromise on performance or security. He'd love to be able to have a lockdown Windows install for work, another for games, and then his Linux desktop all on the same machine without having to reboot to switch between them.
Amen to
that.
He
talks a bit about Cubase OS. It actually kind of reminds me of that L4 microkernel based laptop that's got the 2 installs of Windows. The unsafe one with hardware pass-through to the video card and stuff, so you can play games, and then a second one running in the container that lets you do the work stuff in a secure environment.
Yeah.
Although you access that via an app on the first Windows, and I wonder if that would be too much like VirtualBox and give him the same problems he was having to switch in the first place. And then he goes on to talk about servers and how he'd love to have 10 terabytes of RAM, a terabyte of RAM and 10 plus terabytes of SSD storage with snapshotting. So it sounds like he really wants ZFS.
Who doesn't, Alan?
Yeah.
But all right.
There's a nice long post there, and it'll be interesting I wonder what Bruce Schneier's setup looks like.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm thinking. Hope this series continues.
They should definitely get Brian Krebs to talk about his. I've seen his screen. He's got like 6 screens or something. It's crazy.
It'd be great for that movie. All right. So there's a story that we talked a little teensy bit about on this show and a little bit about on Filter. But do you remember, does the name Sabu ring a bell? the guy that was part of like the anonymous or LulzSec ring, and we all knew that he became an FBI informant. Well, now that some court documents are out, we understand the scope of damage that he did at the behest of the FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's informant targeted more than 24 countries in a series of high-profile cyber attacks in 2012. The names of many of these countries, however, remain secret, sealed under a court order until now. A cache of leaked IRC chat logs and other documents obtained by the Daily Dot reveals 30 countries, including the United Kingdom and Australia, tied to cyber attacks carried out under the direction of Hector Xavier Monascour, better known as Sabu, who served as an FBI informant at the time of the attacks. The actual attacks were carried out by hacktivist Jeremy Hammond, who broke into the countless international websites identified by his partner, being directed by the FBI. At the time, Hammond was unaware that Sabu was working as an FBI informant. Hammond was arrested in March 2012 on charges based largely on what he was told to do by the FBI. Databases containing login credentials, financial details, and private emails of foreign citizens and some government agents were exfiltrated by the hackers, told to do so by Sabu, to do as much damage as possible in the process. So they wrecked the systems as they went in there based on their instructions that he was given by the FBI. After they stole the data, it was routinely uploaded, and the server that it was uploaded to was under the FBI's control.
Yeah.
So they get a guy, they flip
make
him.
it confusing. Like they're talking about, it's like as if he hacked like the UK government rather than some companies whose website happens to be in the UK. So
yeah, it is confusing. But what I don't get is, how do you flip a guy, then you get that guy to go tell a guy to do stuff, and then that guy does the stuff you tell him to do, and then you arrest him for it, right? He didn't do it until you told him to do it, and the people telling him to do it are the people that arrested him. I guess I'm too dumb to figure out how that makes sense. I'm just a dumb person, I guess. All right, our next story in the roundup. Hackers accidentally sold pre-release Xbox One to the FBI.
Yes. So apparently these guys hacked into Microsoft's developer network by getting credentials from somebody that worked at a company where they made games and had access to it. But also apparently Valve and EA and Epic, the guys that make like Unreal Tournament and a couple other gaming companies.
Yep.
But from Microsoft, they managed to get enough source code for the Xbox One that they bought parts for a computer off Newegg and ran the software on it, and it was basically an Xbox.
You're S-ing me, really?
So you could actually build a homebrew Xbox to run Xbox games on your own existing hardware.
Now that I'm all about that. Microsoft should sell that.
Yeah, just Xbox, OS.
Yeah, I got a PC upstairs. I'll put Xbox OS on it. Then I don't have to get their crappy hardware.
In particular, this was buying this basically the same. It's kind of like a Hackintosh. You have to have the hardware that the Xbox expects. But anyway, so some guy offered them, was like, I'll pay you $5,000 for that box. And it turns out that the FBI was behind it, and they were, arresting the people for hacking into Microsoft and Valve and so on.
Yep. All right. I don't have a lot to read on this next one, but I just wanted to make sure we followed up. Libre SSL, more than 30 days later, there's a nice post over on the openbsd.org site. Kind of covering where OpenSSL is at, Heartbleed, why the fork, Libre.
There should be video of this in about a month.
I was suspecting that might be the case.
So this is the actual slides from Ted Unank's talk about Libre SSL.
Yeah.
So back at BSDCan, Bob Beck gave the talk, which we've showed video of.
Yep.
Of the first 30 days after Libre SSL came out. And then Ted's talk this time covered everything that's happened since then until now, and what their plans are for the future, including ReSSL, which is the new API that'll make using SSL in your application much easier and safer.
Very good. Okay, the BBC is covering a story about an eBay security flaw that's likely existed for at least months.
Yes, there's a cross-site scripting or possibly like HTML injection type attack where if you go to eBay and search for something common like an iPhone or something and click a link, you could actually end up getting redirected to another site, leaving eBay when you didn't expect to. And there was like password phishing sites and stuff.
To make it look like an eBay site.
Yeah, so basically you're shopping around eBay and then all of a sudden it asks for a password, you type it in and they stole your eBay account.
eBay logged me out. Those dopes, let me log right back in.
eBay kept saying that, it's not a big problem, and they were tearing down the auctions that were doing it instead of fixing the problem that let those post. BBC said they were able, because the search on eBay only lets you go back 15 days, they were able to find that it's been going on for at least 15 days from when they did the research, but they've got reports saying it started as long ago as February.
Yeah.
But eBay's finally fixed the flaw.
Oh, okay. Very good. All right, well, following up on a thread that you mentioned in the top of the show, OpenVPN is susceptible to the new Shellshock vulnerability, depending. Here's the details that we kind of alluded to earlier in the show. So this is coming from Fredrik Stromberg, the co-founder of Mullvad, a Swedish VPN company that reported the OpenVPN servers are actually vulnerable to Shellshock. There was some debate, I guess, but they said here's how the attack vector would work. OpenVPN has a number of configuration options that can call custom commands during different stages of the tunnel session. Many of these commands are called with environment variable set, some of which are controlled by the client. Stormberg wrote in a post to Hacker News, one option used is like, say, username plus password authentication for when you have the user pass verify option set. This, you could just put the command in that username password area and it would execute that command. So here's how. Then somebody speaking on behalf of the OpenVPN project said that OpenVPN is only vulnerable on systems where bin sh is symlinked to bin bash, or if a script that runs is using bash as an interpreter and bash is called explicitly.
Yeah, which is most Linuxes, but not Debian.
Yeah. So there you go. So if you got OpenVPN.
More importantly, if you're running FreeBSD, you're okay.
There you go. Okay. Or,
next story.
Next story.
Next, the thing that we've talked about many times.
Malvertising?
Yeah, well,
like
particularly we've always said the worst case would be like a large news site gets hacked and infects everybody with malware. Well, in this case, it was the advertising network. It's not clear. It doesn't seem the advertising network got hacked. They just an ad got approved to go out on the network that was
That's all it takes.
Advertising.
That's all it takes.
So the large advertising network Zedo, Z-E-D-O, was found to be serving malware-infected advertisements or malvertisements. And it turns out that Google DoubleClick was having excess inventory, so basically they didn't have any ads to sell at certain points. So they bought, they were basically showing Zedo ads and
filling them in.
The money.
Yeah.
So that meant that anybody using Google DoubleClick ad service was then possibly serving up this malware, which included large sites like Last.fm and the Jerusalem Post and other big newspapers.
We have called this for 2 years at least. We've said this could happen.
We've seen malvertising happens a lot, especially when you get to the shadier advertising networks that advertise like on torrent sites and stuff.
That's my sound clip that I made with my mouth for porn sites.
Right, it's not so much porn sites as
I just wanted an excuse to make the sound, Alan.
Sites that are trying to sell you porn, like you go to the Pirate Bay and there's like bouncing tits on either side of your screen.
Yeah, or that little pop up. I want to do a call with you.
Yeah, or even just the other ones where it's like, oh, make $1,000 a minute.
Yes.
Watch this video,
right?
Or, whatever, all that kind of stuff, or even just poker ones and stuff. And anyway, so a bunch of really legitimate sites were serving malware because of the ad networks. And like somebody in the chat room just said, malware via ad networks is as old as the internet. And the problem is, there's so many ads, it's been possible for Google to actually pay a bunch of people to manually check all the ads before they went out. And part of the problem is sometimes you're loading the content from the producer or whatever so they could change it. Although I think most of them offload it because the ad network wants to be sure that the ad loads quickly, because if it loads slowly, it can slow down the site the advertisement is on, and so on. Like I remember back when like Michael Jackson died and CNN was getting hammered, they actually had to turn their ads off because the ad network wasn't able to keep up,
right?
And it was actually causing the CNN site not to load properly.
Yep. That happens.
And so they actually had to turn the ads off and switch to like no CSS. They had like a very basic page.
Like during there's some of the popular tech blogging sites do that during like CES and keynotes. Like there's like the live blog keynotes and stuff. They'll turn them off too for same reason.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even though it would be their biggest, they make a lot of money. They have to turn down the graphics and stuff on the site.
Well, and like some sites like Engadget and a couple others specifically develop like a whole new blogging engine that they turn online during those events so they can still serve ads.
Yep.
Because it is such a revenue generator.
Well, I remember reading over the specs for the Canadian website, the government website that deals with earthquakes.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, most times we have almost no traffic. But if there's actually an earthquake, we could get immense levels of traffic.
I'm glad they recognize that.
Expand that
and
accommodate it
as
at any time.
That's good that they know that.
Steph and I were just like doing the sign out loud in our heads and stuff. It's like, well, if we do Nginx and make it cached to like static files, and we could manually purge them if they have to do an update during an earthquake or something.
Right, yeah.
And stuff like that, just to like, so their whole back end wouldn't have to be, we wouldn't have to spend a lot of money on servers for their back end. It would just be distributing it. And, you know, they had the requirement that they'd have origins in like 3 different places in the country so that, you know, an earthquake taking out some fiber lines or something wouldn't take out their website.
Right.
Anyway, next story.
All right. So Dropbox and Google want to talk to you about Simple Secure, their initiative, along with the Open Technology Fund, to maybe bring security researchers and experts together under one umbrella to boost.
Well, specifically, they want to put security experts in touch with user interface design experts to try to make new security and cryptography tools that are actually easy to use.
Right.
Now, we've always talked about how security is basically this trade-off between secure. How the more secure it is, the less usable it is.
Right. That's unfortunately.
They're trying to find some middle ground that's enough of both.
I'm a little skeptical. Just, you know, it seems like Google and Dropbox can say, "Oh, look, we're giving money to this to make it," but I hope it actually something materializes from this.
Exactly, but at the same time, it's like, you know, I don't know what. Obviously, it's not. No matter what interface you put on GPG, it's not going to be that easy to use for other people.
Yeah.
And, you know, other stuff like that. In the end, it's like, well, you know, the problem with GPG isn't the user interface so much. It's the fact that not everybody has a key, and the whole key management is the problem. You know, it's like, well, we could go to certificate authorities, but we know that doesn't work. And then, you know, it's like, yeah, how do we do this?
So, Alan, was it just me, or did the internet have a blip recently?
Yes, so there was interesting, why did parts of the internet stop working? And it turns out there's a small company, I think they were a backup company or something, and they have 2 ISPs, which is pretty standard, right?
Sure.
You don't want to depend on one internet line for your whole business.
No.
And they made a small mistake with their routing engine, and basically they took all the routes to the internet from ISP number 1 and started announcing them out ISP number 2. It's basically telling everybody at ISP number 2, if you want to get to Google or Facebook or YouTube or whatever, I'm the closest route.
How does this not happen more often?
Most of the ISPs will have a filter that won't let you send that many routes at once, and you know, automatically say, hey, we're going to disconnect you if you send too many routes, or if you send routes for things we know that aren't you, and things like that.
That makes sense.
Basically, one of their 2 upstreams was a smaller one that apparently had never encountered this before and didn't have a rule for it. And so basically it caused anybody who was closer to that company on as far as routing hops go than they were to the regular route to whatever site they were trying to get to would end up routing through there, and it overloaded their internet connection and took it down basically.
DDoS themselves.
And, but basically it meant that those people then couldn't get to the site they were trying to get to. So on top of DDoSing themselves, they also broke anybody else, a bunch of other people's access to regular websites. But it basically just goes to show how
what a mess.
That can happen by accident, but that could be maliciously done as well.
Sure, that's why they need to put those filters.
And we've talked about it before, right? There was somebody doing the same thing in redirecting traffic going to certain banks to do man-in-the-middle attacks.
Yep, intentionally.
Yep.
The great write-up too with some good shiny charts too, if you guys want to read that in the roundup. Okay, so we've talked about it before, but if you're running anything less than Android 4.4, you're really pretty screwed, and this story kind of confirms that.
Well, especially since the problem there mostly is that nobody runs Android less than 4.4 on purpose. It's more that they just...
Exactly.
They're not given the updates anymore.
Right, exactly. That is, underscore that point, that's for sure. Everybody'd be up to 4.4 if they could. So this is another same origin policy bypass flaw in the Android browser.
So this is the one where basically JavaScript running in one browser tab can actually read the contents of another browser tab.
Yes.
Which is, you know, basically that's supposed to be one of the most fundamental secure things about a browser is that code on one domain can't touch code on another domain. And it turns out the Android browser has a, you know, again, this is, it comes down to that guy's question of open source versus closed source. Because this is open source, when one vulnerability was pointed out, people went and looked and found the other one.
Oh, okay.
Whereas if it was a closed source thing,
going back to Tom,
then the company probably wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't keep looking, and so they wouldn't have found that second one and wouldn't have got it fixed before someone could use it.
So really, at this point, if you're still using the stock browser on Android, stop it and switch to Firefox or secondarily Chrome.
Again, it comes out if you're not going to a malicious site, it's okay. But
I don't know, man.
The ad networks could mean that every site is malicious.
Or I mean, I have been burned several times now by bogus apps. By bogus apps that launch web pages. They install stuff on my phone, and like I have no idea that they're going to launch a web page in my web browser when I do something in the app, and it could be a malicious site. And if this vulnerability exists, it's so frustrating. So get Firefox, set it as your default browser if you're on anything less than 4.4. I like Firefox because it's open source. Chrome's a great browser on mobile as well. You got to get off the open source stock browser because Google's just not really taking care of it. I mean, that's not true. Google updates it, but nobody disseminates those updates. So it's not really Google's fault, except for they're the ones that set it up in this way so it doesn't work properly to begin with. But they do patch it. Nobody deploys those patches, though. So switch off of it right away. The problem is, of course, a lot of apps embed that browser. Components of the operating system embed that browser. So you're never really going to get away from it. But
basically the Internet Explorer of phones now.
Yeah. Ouch. Harsh.
Well, that's the problem. People are like, oh, well, I use Firefox, so I don't bother installing the Internet Explorer updates on from Windows. It's like, well, even Steam is using the built-in Internet Explorer frame, and every app is basically. Yeah,
that MMO you launched to patch. Guess what? That MMO window, that patcher window, is being drawn by Internet Explorer. I mean, like, exactly. It's like it's all over the place. Yeah. It's the HTML renderer for the Windows platform. Just like this Android browser, it's the HTML renderer. I guess in 4.4 they switched it to Chrome. I think that's why 4.4 is not a problem, but yeah.
Even then, it's like if an app's embedding it, it might still be a problem even on 4.4.
Right.
But at least 4.4 still could get an update.
The third-party apps could still embed because it still ships on it with Android. It's included. So yeah. Okay, Alan, is there anything else we want to cover in this week's episode?
No.
Big show. Big show.
Yeah, that was 1,811 words worth of show. So.
Yeah, that's a lot of show.
That was only the docs. I talked a lot more than that.
You can add your words to our show by going over to jupiterbroadcasting.com, clicking the contact link, and choosing TechSNAP from the dropdown. And don't forget, we'd love to have you join us live. We do this show on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific, which is
4 p.m. Eastern, 2000 UTC.
Boom, jblive.tv and jblive.info for the audio-only version. Also, techsnap.reddit.com to submit stories for our roundup and give us an idea of what you'd like to see covered or ask something to our community. And don't forget about those RSS feeds. You can get the show automatically every single week when it comes out. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for tuning this week's episode of TechSNAP. We'll see you right back here next week.